The region that began everything did not announce itself with ceremony. It arrived quietly in 1996, carried in a small gray cartridge, and inside it were 151 creatures that would eventually become some of the most recognized designs in the history of popular culture. Kanto was drawn from a real part of Japan, from the Kanto Plain and the surrounding landscapes, and it carried within its roots and towns and tall grasses a density of detail that most players never fully uncovered. And before we continue our journey, please consider subscribing to Join the Cozy Club for more journey like this, and let me know where in the world you are currently watching from tonight. Bulbasaur is Pokemon number 1 in the National Pokédex, and that placement was not accidental. It was chosen deliberately, and the choice carries a kind of quiet philosophy about how the designers understood their own creation. Of all the Pokemon in the original 151, Bulbasaur was selected to occupy the first position. Not because it was the most powerful, not because it was the most visually striking, but because its design represented something foundational. A creature that combined plant and animal in a way that felt genuinely strange and genuinely alive at the same time. The bulb on Bulbasaur's back is not a separate organism. It is part of the Pokemon itself, grown into its skin since birth, developing alongside it as it grows. This detail is present in the Pokédex entries from the very beginning of the franchise. The seed was planted at birth, and it germinates as the Pokemon ages, drawing energy from sunlight and growing into the flowering blossom that defines Bulbasaur's final evolution. The relationship between the creature and its plant component is not parasitic and not purely symbiotic in the conventional sense. It is something more integrated than either of those words suggests. The real-world inspiration for Bulbasaur draws from multiple directions. The body shape and general posture reference the toad and the frog, amphibians that sit low to the ground with wide stances and patient stillness. The name itself combines the Dutch and Afrikaans word bulb with the Greek word for lizard, and this combination points toward the hybrid nature of the design. Something between categories, between the animal and the botanical, between the familiar and the strange. Bulbasaur's typing as grass and poison was unusual in the context of the original games. Grass type was one of the less offensively dominant typings in Generation 1, with relatively few powerful grass-type moves available and significant weaknesses to fire, ice, flying, and bug. The poison typing added additional weaknesses while providing limited additional offensive coverage. What the typing did provide was access to a particular style of play centered on status moves and gradual wearing down of opponents rather than direct offensive power. Sleep Powder, Leech Seed, and Poison Powder are moves that defined how Bulbasaur and its evolutions functioned in practical gameplay during the original generation. Leech Seed, in particular, was a move that had no direct equivalent among other early Pokemon, draining a small amount of health from the opponent each turn and transferring it to the user. The move required patience and a willingness to play across multiple turns rather than seeking immediate resolution. Players who understood its value found in Bulbasaur's line a kind of strategic depth that the more immediately impressive starter options did not quite offer. Ivysaur is Bulbasaur's first evolution, reached at level 16, and it is one of the more visually interesting middle evolutions in the original roster. The bulb has begun to open, petals visible but not yet fully spread, suggesting transformation still in progress rather than transformation complete. The design communicates exactly what a middle evolution should communicate. Something that has come far from where it started, but has not yet arrived at where it is going. Venusaur, the final evolution reached at level 32, represents the complete opening of the flower. The large pink blossom at the center of its back is one of the most visually distinctive design elements in the original 151, bold and vivid against the green of the creature's body, an arrangement that feels genuinely alien when examined carefully and genuinely appealing when encountered in the context of play. The flower absorbs sunlight and converts it to energy, and the Pokédex entries across multiple generations describe Venusaur seeking open places to bask and gather solar energy during the day. The Venusaur line has maintained consistent, competitive relevance across multiple generations of the franchise, which is notable for a starter Pokémon from the original games. In Generation 6, Venusaur received a Mega Evolution that dramatically increased its bulk and gave it the ability Thick Fat, which halved the damage it received from fire and ice-type moves, its two most significant natural weaknesses. The result was a Pokémon that had addressed its primary defensive vulnerabilities while retaining its offensive and utility toolkit, creating a genuinely formidable, competitive presence decades after the original design was created. Charmander begins as a small orange lizard with a flame burning at the tip of its tail. The Pokédex entries establish very early that this flame is not decorative. It is the Pokémon's life force made visible. If the flame goes out, the Pokémon dies. This detail is present in the very first generation of the games, and it transforms Charmander from a simple fire-type starter into something more philosophically interesting. A creature whose vulnerability is visible, whose mortality is expressed through the brightness and steadiness of a small flame that can be extinguished by rain or by water or by some force sufficiently greater than the creature's own will to survive. The flame burns brighter when Charmander is in good health and when it is battling with enthusiasm. It burns lower and dimmer when the Pokémon is ill or weakened. This visual externalization of internal state is a design principle that appears throughout the Pokémon franchise, but finds one of its clearest and most resonant expressions in Charmander's tail flame. Players who knew this detail experienced the early roots of Pokémon Red and Blue differently. The small lizard in the tall grass was not just a collection of stats, it was a creature with a flame that could go out. Charmeleon, the evolution at level 16, shifts the tone of the line considerably, where Charmander is described as friendly and affectionate toward trainers who care for it. Charmeleon is described as difficult, aggressive, easily provoked, and prone to attacking trainers who cannot meet its standards. The behavioral change between evolution stages is a narrative choice that mirrors something true about development and growth. The transition from a creature that needs others to a creature that insists on its own terms is not always a smooth or gentle passage. Charizard arrived in popular consciousness as one of the most desired Pokémon in the original games, and the reasons for that status reveal something interesting about how players responded to the franchise's design language. Charizard is visually dramatic. It is a dragon in everything but its official typing, which categorizes it as fire and flying rather than fire and dragon, a distinction that had significant mechanical consequences in the original competitive landscape, and that many players found genuinely surprising when they learned it. The decision to give Charizard a fire and flying typing rather than a fire and dragon typing has been discussed extensively in the context of the franchise's history. In Generation 1, Dragon type had almost no weaknesses, and the only Dragon type move available was Dragon Rage, which dealt a fixed 40 damage regardless of any stat. Making Charizard a Dragon type in that mechanical context would have created a visually imposing Pokémon that was practically difficult to use and difficult to counter, an imbalance that the designers apparently chose to avoid by giving it a more conventional typing pair. Despite its draconic appearance, Charizard received not one but two Mega Evolutions in Generation 6, Mega Charizard X and Mega Charizard Y, a distinction shared with only a small number of Pokémon in the franchise. Mega Charizard X corrected the typing decision that had stood for nearly 2 decades giving the form a fire and dragon typing that aligned with the creature's visual identity. Mega Charizard X's appearance also shifted dramatically, with a black and blue color scheme that departed from every previous version of the design, presenting something that felt genuinely new while remaining recognizably Charizard. The decision to give Charizard 2 Mega Evolutions rather than one was a commercial and design choice that acknowledged the Pokemon's cultural significance, while also creating 2 meaningfully different competitive tools rather than one. Squirtle is the third starter Pokemon available in the original games, a small blue turtle with a curling tail and a shell that carries both defensive and aesthetic meaning. The shell is part of Squirtle's body, and it grows alongside the Pokemon, hardening progressively as the creature ages. The Pokédex entries describe Squirtle retracting into its shell at the first sign of danger and launching powerful jets of water from its mouth with exceptional precision even at great distances. The water type in Generation 1 was offensively strong and defensively reliable, carrying few common weaknesses and access to a range of powerful moves. Surf was the most significant water-type move available in the original games, a powerful attack with high base power that could be taught to any Pokemon that could use HMs. Squirtle's line had access to Surf and to Ice Beam and Blizzard, making it one of the more versatile offensive tools in the original game's roster for players who understood how to use its coverage. Wartortle, the middle evolution, at level 16, develops the ear-like protrusions that become more prominent with age. The Pokédex notes that the longer Wartortle's ears are, the older the individual is, making age directly readable in the design. The curled tail also becomes more elaborate through the evolutionary line, gaining more volume and texture in each stage. Blastoise, the final evolution reached at level 36, introduces the most visually distinctive element of the line: 2 large water cannons mounted on its shell that can fire with enough pressure to pierce through steel. Blastoise's water cannons are the design element that most clearly establishes what the creature is built to do. Not a passive defender hiding inside a shell, but an active combatant that uses its shell as a turret platform, directing enormous hydraulic force at precisely chosen targets. The Pokédex entries across generations describe the pressure of these cannons as sufficient to create holes in concrete and to drive opponents back over enormous distances. The visual language of the design communicates overwhelming, controlled force delivered with calm precision, which is consistent with Blastoise's general framing as a powerful and steady Pokémon rather than an aggressive or erratic one. The Blastoise line received Mega Evolution in Generation 6, giving Mega Blastoise a third cannon mounted on its shell in addition to the 2 on its arms. The competitive application of Mega Blastoise centered on its ability Mega Launcher, which boosted the power of Pulse and Aura moves by 50%. Water Pulse, Aura Sphere, and Dark Pulse all benefited from this boost, creating a coverage spread that was genuinely broad and that rewarded players who knew the full scope of what Mega Blastoise's ability interacted with. Caterpie is Pokemon number 10, a small green caterpillar with large expressive eyes and a distinctive orange osmeterium, the Y-shaped organ that real caterpillars use as a defense mechanism, releasing unpleasant scents to deter predators. In the Pokemon games, Caterpie's primary characteristic is its simplicity. It has very low base stats, learns only Tackle and String Shot before it evolves, and represents one of the most straightforward design philosophies in the franchise. A creature that is not impressive and is not meant to be, but that becomes impressive through transformation. The evolutionary path from Caterpie to Metapod at level 7 and then to Butterfree at level 10 is one of the most compressed in the original games. 10 levels is not a long journey by the standards of most evolutionary lines in the franchise, and the speed of Caterpie's transformation is consistent with the real-world life cycle of the butterfly and moth species it draws from. Actual caterpillars in nature have metamorphosis timelines measured in days or weeks rather than years, and the sense of rapid transformation is part of what makes the Caterpie line feel ecologically grounded even within the fantasy context of the games. Metapod is a creature that can do almost nothing. Its primary move in the original games is Harden, which raises its own defense stat, and it has no offensive capability worth considering. This is an entirely intentional design choice that mirrors what a chrysalis actually is in nature. A structure that has ceased to function as an active organism and is instead devoting its entire biological process to internal reorganization. Metapod is not fighting, it is becoming, and the game communicates this by making it functionally helpless in battle. Butterfree emerges from Metapod at level 10, and the transition is one of the clearest illustrations of transformation as a thematic principle in the original games. The small green caterpillar becomes a butterfly with large compound eyes, membranous wings, dusted with scales, and access to one of the most useful status movesets in early Generation 1 gameplay. Sleep Powder, Stun Spore, and Poison Powder give Butterfree the ability to inflict 3 different status conditions reliably, making it a genuinely capable tool for catching wild Pokémon, as well as for battling opponents who underestimate it based on its modest damage output. The real-world biology that Butterfree draws from is among the most extraordinary processes in the natural world. Inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar's body undergoes histolysis, a process in which most of its larval tissue breaks down into raw biological material from which the adult butterfly's structures are constructed. The resulting creature shares DNA with the caterpillar, but has rebuilt almost every physical structure it possesses. New eyes, new legs, new wings, a fundamentally reorganized nervous system, a relationship with the physical environment that is entirely different from what existed before. Whether any continuity of experience persists through that reorganization remains an open biological question. Butterfree became one of the most emotionally significant Pokémon in the anime through the farewell episode in which Ash releases his Butterfree to join a migration with other Butterfree and a potential mate. The episode aired early in the original anime series and established that the program was willing to use loss and separation as emotional tools, not just victory and growth. The farewell to Butterfree is referenced consistently in discussions of the anime's emotional high points, and its effectiveness depended entirely on the audience having developed genuine attachment to a creature that began as an unremarkable green caterpillar in early tall grass. Weedle is Pokémon number 13, the counterpart to Caterpie found in Pokémon Blue rather than Pokémon Red in the original game version split. It is a small yellow caterpillar with a large poison barb on its head and a smaller one at its tail, and its design communicates its primary function immediately. Where Caterpie was defensive, retreating from threats, Weedle is armed from birth, equipped with a venomous spike that even the smallest and most vulnerable stage of the creature presents as a potential hazard. Kakuna, Weedle's middle evolution, at level 7, shares Metapod's functional helplessness in battle, able to do little beyond harden. The visual design of Kakuna is harder and more angular than Metapod's rounded green shape, presenting a chrysalis that looks more like a protective casing and less like an organic growth. Beedrill, the final evolution, at level 10, is one of the more aggressively designed Pokémon in the original roster. 3 large stingers, 2 on its arms, and 1 at the end of its abdomen, a body pattern that references the warning coloration of real wasps, and Pokédex entries that describe territorial aggression and organized group attacks against anything perceived as a threat. Beedrill received a Mega Evolution in Generation 6 that transformed it into one of the fastest Pokemon available in that competitive era. Mega Beedrill's speed stat reaches 150, placing it among the fastest non-legendary Pokemon in the generation, and its attack stat reaches 150 as well. The ability Adaptability, which increases the power of moves that match the user's type from a standard bonus to a doubled bonus, combined with Beedrill's access to Drill Run and Poison Jab, created a mega evolution that was both thematically consistent with the base design and genuinely threatening in competitive play, despite the original Beedrill having been considered one of the weaker final evolutions in the original roster. Pidgey is Pokemon number 16, a small normal and flying type bird that occupies the ecological niche of the most common early route encounter in the original Kanto games. It appears in almost every early grass patch, it has modest stats, and its design is intentionally unremarkable. A small brown bird with a round body and pink highlights around its eyes and beak. The ordinariness of Pidgey is a deliberate design choice. Not every Pokemon is intended to be remarkable. Some are intended to populate the world with the kind of familiar, ordinary creatures that make a world feel inhabited rather than curated. Pidgeotto at level 18 and Pidgeot at level 36 represent a progression from the common toward the genuinely impressive. Pidgeot's Pokédex entries describe flight speeds of Mach 2, hunting patterns that involve diving from altitude to catch prey, and a territorial range that extends over many miles. The final form takes the ordinary beginning and transforms it into something genuinely capable, which is a design pattern the franchise returns to repeatedly. Starting with the familiar and arriving at the extraordinary through the process of development. Rattata is Pokemon number 19, a small purple rat with large front teeth and an expression that the original sprite rendered as perpetually intense and alert. The Rattata line is another of the franchise's deliberate ordinary entries, a creature so common in the early roots that many players spent the first hours of the original games seeing it more than anything else. Its presence in such abundance was ecologically intentional. Rattata is described in the Pokédex as extremely adaptable, capable of living in almost any environment, eating almost anything, and reproducing rapidly. These characteristics mirror exactly the ecological strategies of the rodents that inspired it. Raticate at level 20 represents a significant increase in speed and physical power from Rattata's already respectable speed stat. The design shifts from the small and somewhat cute Rattata towards something more aggressive, with larger teeth, more imposing proportions, and a general presentation that reads as capable of genuine damage. Raticate became the subject of one of the franchise's most persistent and somewhat melancholy pieces of fan analysis. The rival character in the original games has a Raticate at certain early points in the story that is absent from his party later, and speculation about what happened to it became a long-running conversation in the community about the game's willingness to imply difficult things without stating them explicitly. Spearow is Pokemon number 21, a small normal and flying type bird that differs from Pidgey in its presentation and attitude. Where Pidgey is mild and non-threatening, Spearow is described as aggressive, easily angered, and prone to attacking perceived threats with the coordinated ferocity of a flock. The design uses a ruffled, somewhat disheveled appearance to communicate irritability, with small, sharp eyes and an expression that reads as constantly prepared for confrontation. The contrast between Pidgey and Spearow in the early roots establishes that even within the same general ecological category, different species can carry fundamentally different temperamental qualities. Fearow at level 20 develops into one of the larger bird Pokemon available in the original games. Its long beak is designed for drilling into the ground, for prey, and for precise striking in combat, and the Pokédex entries describe it as capable of sustained flight over the course of an entire day without rest. The wing design emphasizes power and endurance over grace, and the overall impression is of a hunter that has been shaped by the need to survive in a world where persistence matters more than delicacy. Akons is Pokemon number 23, a purple snake with a yellow rattle at its tail and yellow markings at its neck. The name is Snake, spelled backward, a naming convention that was used for several Pokemon in the original roster, and that has been both appreciated and gently mocked over the years as an example of the franchise's early approach to nomenclature. Akons' design draws directly from real-world venomous snakes, particularly the characteristics associated with king cobras and rattlesnakes, combining the hood-spreading behavior of the former with the auditory warning mechanism of the latter. Arbok at level 22 develops the hood that was implied in Akons' design into a fully realized defensive and threatening display. The pattern on Arbok's hood is one of the most regionally variable elements in the franchise's design history. Different versions of the games in different regions featured slightly different patterns on Arbok's hood, and Pokédex entries acknowledge this regional variation explicitly, noting that the hood markings differ depending on where the individual Pokémon was raised. This acknowledgement of interspecies variation based on geographic origin is a genuine nod toward real-world biological principles of population variation and regional adaptation. Pikachu is Pokemon number 25, and it became the face of the entire franchise through a series of decisions that were not entirely planned from the beginning. In the original games, Pikachu was one of several electric-type Pokemon available, not the only one and not necessarily the one most players gravitated toward naturally. Raichu, its evolution, had higher base stats, and Voltorb and Electrode offered different electric-type options earlier in the game. Pikachu's rise to cultural prominence was accelerated by its role in the anime, where it became Ash's primary partner and was present in every episode of the original series. The relationship between the anime Pikachu and the game Pikachu created a feedback loop that shaped both properties over time. The anime established Pikachu as having a distinct personality, a voice, preferences, and an emotional range that made it feel like a genuine companion rather than a game piece. The games eventually acknowledged this status through the Pokemon Yellow version, which put a Pikachu that followed the player as a visible companion at the center of the experience. Yellow was released after the anime had established Pikachu's status, and it functioned partly as a way to make the game experience align more closely with what viewers of the show were seeing. Pikachu's design draws from a mouse as its primary reference and from the squirrel as a secondary one. The round cheeks that store electricity, the bolt-shaped tail that became the most recognizable element of the silhouette, the large expressive eyes that communicate emotion clearly at small sprite sizes. All of these were design choices that created something with enormous practical reproducibility. Pikachu can be drawn simply, recognized instantly, and printed on almost any surface, which contributed practically to its status as a merchandising anchor for the entire franchise. The base stats of Pikachu in the original games were actually relatively modest by the standards of the full roster. 120 speed made it genuinely fast, but its physical and special attack stats were not exceptional, and its defensive stats were low enough that it could be knocked out by a single powerful hit from a same-level opponent. Players who tried to use their anime-beloved Pikachu in serious competitive play during Generation 1 often found it underperformed expectations. The competitive gap between Pikachu's cultural status and its practical game performance became one of the franchise's recurring gentle ironies. Raichu, at level above 25 through Thunderstone application, developed into a significantly more capable offensive Pokémon with higher attack, special attack, and speed stats than Pikachu, but a loss of the charm associated with the smaller form. The Pokemon Yellow game version made the story beat of Pikachu's reluctance to evolve into Raichu a narrative element, giving players a version of their companion that actively resisted transformation and preferred to remain as it was. This choice reflected and reinforced the broader cultural preference for Pikachu over Raichu that the anime had established, and it created an interesting tension between mechanical optimization and emotional attachment that players resolved individually in different ways. Sandshrew is Pokemon number 27, a ground-type creature based on the pangolin and the hedgehog, with a heavily armored yellow body and the ability to curl into a ball for protection. The pangolin is one of the world's most trafficked animals, heavily targeted in the illegal wildlife trade for its scales and meat, and Sandshrew's design captures the pangolin's most visually distinctive characteristic, the overlapping keratin scales that cover its body, in a form that makes the animal's qualities immediately visible and understandable to a young audience that might not otherwise encounter the real-world creature at all. Sandslash at level 22 develops the defensive and offensive potential of Sandshrew's design into something more aggressive. Where Sandshrew's primary response to threat is to curl into a defensive sphere, Sandslash uses its claws and the sharp edges of its scales as offensive tools, slashing with speed and precision that Pokédex entries describe as capable of leaving lasting marks on opponents. The evolution shifts the emphasis from passive defense to active response, a transition that parallels the developmental journey from vulnerability to capability. Nidoran female and Nidoran male are among the earliest examples in the franchise of a design principle that would recur across multiple generations. Two related creatures presented as separate Pokédex entries with different evolutionary lines and somewhat different design emphasis, despite sharing a common inspiration. The Nidoran pair draws from the horned rodents of the real world, with the female's design being somewhat smaller and the male's somewhat more aggressively presented, mirroring real-world sexual dimorphism in horned animals without requiring players to know the term for that biological phenomenon. Nidorina and Nidorino are the middle evolutions, both reached at level 16, both featuring larger horns and more developed armor than their pre-evolutionary forms. The most mechanically unusual aspect of the Nidoran evolutionary lines is Nidorina's incompatibility with the egg group that would allow it to breed in later generations. Nidorina and Nidoqueen both belong to an egg group that cannot breed with any other Pokémon, which means the only way to obtain a Nidoran female from the beginning is to catch one in the wild or receive one through a trade. This mechanical quirk has been discussed across generations as an example of an early design decision that created unexpected consequences as the breeding system was introduced and expanded. Nidoqueen and Nidoking are the final evolutions of their respective lines, both achieved through application of the Moonstone. They are among the first examples in the franchise of a stone evolution creating a dramatic physical transformation, with both forms becoming significantly larger and more imposing than their pre-evolutionary stages. Nidoking in particular became notable in competitive contexts in later generations due to its access to an enormous variety of special moves and to the ability Sheer Force in Generation 5, which removed the secondary effects of moves like Earth Power and Ice Beam while increasing their power by 30%, creating a powerful and versatile special attacker from a design that had been considered largely outclassed for several generations. Clefairy is Pokemon number 35, a pink normal-type creature that was originally considered as the franchise's mascot before that role was given to Pikachu. The original design direction for the anime reportedly planned for Clefairy to be Ash's primary partner and the shift to Pikachu was made based on considerations about the visual appeal and marketability of each design. Clefairy's rounded, gentle appearance and its associations with the moon and with mysterious origins from the Pokédex lore gave it a different kind of appeal, more ethereal and less immediately accessible than Pikachu's electric vitality. Clefairy's Pokédex entries across generations describe it as having come from space, appearing under full moons in mountainous areas, and possessing an ability to make those around it feel a sense of happiness and peace. These characteristics establish Clefairy as one of the franchise's earliest examples of a Pokémon with a genuine mythological and cosmic dimension to its lore, connected to lunar cycles and celestial origins, in a way that is unusual for a creature that otherwise appears domestic and approachable. Clefable, the evolution through Moonstone, represents the full development of Clefairy's mysterious qualities. Pokédex entries describe Clefable moving so quietly that it cannot be heard even when it is running, hearing a pin drop from a distance of over a mile, and appearing on moonlit mountains as though it descended from somewhere beyond the ordinary world. The design retains the gentle, rounded qualities of Clefairy, while suggesting something more substantial and more capable, a creature that has arrived at the full realization of whatever strange nature it was always moving toward. Vulpix is Pokémon number 37, a fire-type creature based on the Japanese fox spirit, the kitsune, one of the most recognizable figures in Japanese folklore. Kitsune are spirits that can transform, that accumulate wisdom and power over time, and that are strongly associated with fire in their supernatural manifestations. Vulpix begins with a single tail that splits over time as the Pokémon grows and gains experience, and this growth mechanic is referenced in the Pokédex entries that note young Vulpix have fewer split ends in their tails than older individuals. Ninetales, the evolution through Firestone, represents the full flowering of the Kitsune design influence. 9 tails is the maximum number associated with the most powerful kitsune in Japanese folklore, creatures of enormous age and accumulated supernatural ability. The Pokédex entries for Ninetales describe it as living for 1,000 years and harboring deep intelligence and memory, able to understand human language and to curse those who mistreat it with a 10-year curse for every tail that is touched. These descriptions create a portrait of a creature with genuine depth of lore rather than a simple fire-type fox. Jigglypuff is Pokémon number 39, a normal and fairy-type balloon Pokémon whose primary ability is a singing voice that puts listeners to sleep. The Pokédex entries describe Jigglypuff's eyes as entrancing opponents and holding them in place, while its song gradually lulls them into sleep, and the anime developed this characteristic into a running joke through the recurring appearance of a Jigglypuff who would use a microphone and then become furious when its audience fell asleep during its performance, drawing on their faces with a marker as a retribution. The Jigglypuff anime appearances were a consistent comedic element across many episodes of the original series, and they worked because the frustration was understandable, even as it was absurd. A creature whose only distinguishing ability creates an audience that cannot remain conscious to appreciate it is a design with genuine comic tragedy built in, and the franchise's willingness to lean into that irony rather than resolving it created one of its most consistently entertaining minor characters. Wigglytuff, at level above Jigglypuff through Moonstone, develops into a significantly bulkier and more assertive form while retaining the general design language of its pre-evolution. The competitive applications of the Jigglypuff and Wigglytuff line across generations have varied considerably, with Wigglytuff finding particular value in later generations as a fairy-type addition to team compositions that needed that typing's specific coverage and defensive properties. Zubat is Pokémon number 41, and it became one of the most notorious encounters in the original Kanto games through its extreme frequency in caves and dark areas. Zubat has no eyes, navigating entirely through echolocation, and the design communicates this directly through eye sockets that are simply absent. Okay. The creature is entirely dependent on its sonar to perceive the world, and Pokédex entries note that Zubat avoids areas where sunlight reaches, a characteristic that is consistent with the behavior of real cave-dwelling bat species. The frequency of Zubat encounters in rock tunnel and other cave areas in the original games created a specific kind of player experience that mixed genuine frustration with a kind of grudging respect for the consistency of the world building. Cave areas in Kanto were hostile primarily because Zubat was everywhere in them, and the repetitive nature of those encounters impressed upon players that these were not welcoming spaces, that moving through them required effort and resource management, and that the world of Kanto had genuinely threatening territories as well as pleasant routes. Golbat at level 22 develops into one of the more imposing cave Pokémon in the original roster, with an enormous mouth that takes up most of its face and 2 sets of fangs. The design emphasizes the bat's role as an ambush predator, a creature that attacks suddenly and without warning, and Pokédex entries describe Golbat as drinking blood from sleeping prey and from Pokémon and people alike. Crobat, the evolution added in Generation 2, became available through High Friendship, which created an interesting mechanical requirement that rewarded players who treated their Golbat well enough to evolve it, rather than simply reaching a certain level. Oddish is Pokémon number 43, a small grass and poison type creature that looks like a round blue body with a tuft of leaves growing from its head. The design suggests a walking plant more than it suggests a conventional animal, and the Pokédex entries reinforce this impression by describing Oddish as burying its roots in the ground during the day and walking around at night to scatter its seeds. The boundary between plant and animal that characterizes several of the original grass-type designs finds one of its simplest and most direct expressions in Oddish. Gloom, at level 21, introduces a dramatic change in the line's presentation. Where Oddish was relatively neutral and slightly endearing, Gloom is described as emitting an extraordinarily powerful and unpleasant odor, a smell so terrible that it makes those who encounter it feel physically ill. The drooping posture, the half-closed eyes, and the drop of liquid trailing from its mouth all contribute to a design that communicates toxicity and decay rather than the fresh growth that Oddish suggested. The transition from Oddish to Gloom is one of the more startling aesthetic shifts in the original evolutionary lines. Vileplume, the evolution through Leafstone, develops the poison element into something more active and more elaborate. The enormous flower on Vileplume's head is modeled after the Rafflesia arnoldi, the largest individual flower in the world, and also one of the most foul-smelling plants on Earth, known for producing an odor resembling rotting flesh to attract the flies and beetles that pollinate it. The choice to base Vileplume's design on a plant that is enormous, visually striking, and notoriously malodorous is entirely consistent with the design language established by Gloom's odor theme. Blossom was added as an alternate evolution from Gloom in Generation 2 through the Sunstone, providing a branching path that represented a fundamentally different interpretation of the original plant design. Where Vileplume developed the toxicity, Blossom developed the flower with a bright and cheerful design that emphasized dancing and the tropics. The existence of both final evolutions from a single middle stage illustrates a design principle that became more common in later generations. The idea that evolution can represent different aspects of a creature's potential rather than simply a linear progression toward more of the same. Paras is Pokémon number 46, a small bug-type creature with mushrooms growing from its back, and it carries one of the most subtly unsettling backstories in the original roster once the full details are absorbed. The mushrooms on Paras's back are not part of the Pokémon. They are a separate organism, a parasitic fungus called tochukaso that grows on the Pokemon's body and gradually establishes increasing control over it. Pokedex entries note that the mushrooms absorb nutrients from paras, and that as the Pokemon evolves, the mushrooms grow larger relative to the body, suggesting an increasing degree of parasitic dominance. Parasect at level 24 is the full expression of this parasitic relationship. The mushroom has grown so large that it covers most of the body, and Pokedex entries in later generations describe the host creature as essentially no longer present within Parasect, replaced entirely by the fungus that now controls its movements and behavior. The vacant eyes of Parasect's design, rendered without the slight sheen or expression that suggests an active consciousness, communicate this condition visually in a way that registers as subtly wrong even to players who have not read the Pokedex entries. Something behind those eyes is not the creature that began the journey. Venonat is Pokemon number 48, a small bug and poison type with enormous compound eyes that take up most of its face. The eyes glow in darkness, allowing Venonat to detect prey at night, and the fine hairs covering its body collect poison that it can use defensively. The design draws from moths and from the general category of night-active insects, whose most visually striking characteristic is their large, light-sensitive eyes. Venomoth at level 31 develops the moth element fully, with patterned wings that release poisonous scales when beaten together, a characteristic drawn from the wing scale mechanics of real moths and butterflies. Diglett is Pokemon number 50, one of the franchise's most deliberately mysterious original designs. A small brown creature emerging from a hole in the ground with two small eyes and a prominent nose, showing absolutely no other physical features. What lies beneath the surface of the ground, where Diglett spends most of its time, has been a topic of genuinely committed fan speculation since the original games, with theories ranging from small feet to nothing at all to something too strange for the designers to depict directly. The games have maintained this ambiguity deliberately for decades, occasionally acknowledging it with knowing humor. Dugtrio at level 26 is 3 Diglett emerging from the same hole, and the design raises all of the same questions in triplicate. Are they 3 separate creatures sharing a common underground body? Are they 3 entirely independent Diglett that happen to move together in perfect synchronization? Pokedex entries have teased both possibilities across generations without definitively resolving the question. Alolan Dugtrio, introduced in the Alola region games, added long flowing golden hair to each of the 3 heads, a regional variant that both committed fully to the absurdity of the original design and added new questions about what exactly that hair was for. Meowth is Pokemon number 52, a normal type cat Pokemon with a gold coin embedded in its forehead, a characteristic drawn from the Maneki Neko, the beckoning cat figure that appears widely across Japanese and Chinese cultures as a symbol of good fortune. The Maneki Neko's raised paw beckons luck and prosperity, and Meowth's association with coins and with finding and collecting shiny objects draws from the same symbolic vocabulary. The franchise's decision to make the Team Rocket Meowth one of the most prominent recurring characters in the anime, and specifically to give him the ability to speak human language, created one of the more complex and sympathetic villain companions in the series. Anime Meowth learned to speak human language out of a desire to impress a female Meowth named Meowsy, spending enormous effort to teach himself human speech and to walk upright, only to be rejected by her as too strange. This origin story, told in a flashback episode, transformed Meowth from a comedic sidekick into a character with a genuine emotional history and a longing for connection that his villainous role consistently frustrated. The decision to give Meowth this backstory was one of the anime's most humanizing choices for a non-human character. Persian at level 28 represents the evolution of Meowth's design into something more aristocratic and refined, losing the endearing coin forehead earnestness of the smaller form in favor of a sleek, elegant presentation. The coin becomes a gem embedded in Persian's forehead, and the design shifts from the slightly scruffy street cat energy of Meowth towards something more like the pampered companion of someone wealthy and discerning. Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket in the original games and anime, is consistently depicted with a Persian resting in his lap or on his desk, and this design choice communicates his character through his companion's presentation more efficiently than any direct description could. Psyduck is Pokemon number 54, a water-type duck Pokemon with perpetual headaches that are simultaneously the source of its suffering and the source of its power. When Psyduck's headaches become severe enough, they trigger psychic abilities that Psyduck does not fully understand or control, releasing waves of psychic energy that can be genuinely powerful without the Pokemon having any conscious mastery of what it is doing. This design, a creature with abilities that arrive as symptoms of distress rather than as deliberate tools, creates something philosophically interesting about the relationship between suffering and power. The anime developed Psyduck's headache mechanic into one of its most consistently used character elements through Misty's Psyduck, which would emerge from its ball at inopportune moments rather than when called, spend battles holding its head in confusion, and occasionally produce wildly powerful psychic attacks during moments of extreme pain. The unpredictability of Misty's Psyduck became a running element of the original series, and its occasional moments of genuine effectiveness made those moments more meaningful for having been unpredictable. Golduck at level 33 represents the full development of Psyduck's psychic potential into something consciously wielded. Where Psyduck's psychic abilities were accidental and distress-driven, Golduck's are deliberate and powerful. The design shifts from the confused, pained expression of Psyduck towards something more serene and focused, communicating that the painful transition through chronic discomfort has arrived at a place of genuine capability. The gem on Golduck's forehead glows when its psychic power is active, a visual callback to Psyduck's ruby red center that now reads as a feature rather than a symptom. Mankey is Pokemon number 56, a fighting-type creature based on the snub-nosed monkey with an extraordinarily low anger threshold. Pokédex entries describe Mankey as prone to furious outbursts triggered by almost anything, capable of attacking without warning and continuing to rage for extended periods. The design uses a simple, somewhat blank face to communicate a general state of barely suppressed fury rather than a specific emotional reaction, and the round, uniform white face with tiny eyes and a prominent nose creates a blank canvas onto which extreme emotional states can be projected. Primeape at level 28 develops Mankey's anger into something more purposeful and more physically capable. The design adds visible veins and a more muscular presentation while retaining the same basic face structure, suggesting that the anger has intensified rather than been replaced by more complex emotion. Pokédex entries note that Primeape cannot calm down once it begins pursuing an opponent, continuing the chase regardless of distance or obstacle. Later games added the evolved form Annihilip, which arrives when Primeape dies while enraged, a post-mortem transformation that takes the anger theme to its logical extreme in a direction that is simultaneously absurd and genuinely unsettling. Growlithe is Pokemon number 58, a fire-type dog Pokemon with striking orange and black striped fur that draws from both the Shisa, a lion-dog figure from Okinawan mythology used as a protective guardian, and the general design vocabulary of the Akita, a Japanese dog breed with distinctive markings. Growlithe is described throughout its Pokedex entries as intensely loyal, protective, and courageous, willing to defend its territory and its trainer from any threat regardless of size. This personality description made Growlithe and its evolution one of the most beloved Pokemon among players who valued the companion aspect of the franchise over the strategic dimension. Arcanine at level above Growlithe through Firestone is one of the original roster's most visually impressive designs, a large, mane-covered dog with a cloud-like fur pattern and a legendary status that Pokedex entries explicitly acknowledge. The legendary Pokemon entry refers to Arcanine as a legendary Pokemon in one of the original games, a description that created confusion alongside Pokemon that are mechanically categorized as legendary. Arcanine's speed, described as capable of running 1,000 miles in a single day and a night, and its commanding regal appearance established it as occupying a class above most ordinary Pokemon even before the legendary label was applied. Poliwag is Pokemon number 60, a water-type tadpole with a transparent belly through which its internal spiral is visible. The spiral is the creature's intestines, and the design makes this internal structure the most visually prominent element of the design. This choice to render viscera as a design feature rather than concealing it is unusual among the original roster, and it gives Poliwag a slightly surreal quality that distinguishes it from more conventionally rendered water-type Pokemon. The counterclockwise direction of the spiral in the original design was reversed in the Western release, reflecting a difference in cultural associations between the two directions of spiral. Poliwhirl at level 25 and Poliwrath through Waterstone developed the tadpole design in different directions. Poliwrath became one of the original game's most versatile competitive options, with access to both Surf and Ice Beam for offensive coverage, Hypnosis for status control, and a fighting type that was mechanically useful for hitting normal types. The combination of water and fighting typing was unique in the original roster, and Poliwrath occupied a specific competitive niche that no other available Pokemon could replicate. Politoed, added as an alternate evolution in Generation 2 through trading while holding the King's Rock, developed the frog aspect of the design into something rounder and more cheerful, with the evolution path acknowledging the biological reality that tadpoles become frogs rather than simply larger tadpoles. Abra is Pokemon number 63, a psychic-type creature that sleeps for approximately 18 hours per day and uses the remaining waking time to teleport away from any threat it perceives. Its only move in the original games is Teleport, which cannot be used to end battles and serves only to escape from wild encounters, meaning that catching an Abra in the original games required either using a Pokeball before it teleported away on the first turn or putting it to sleep beforehand. The mechanical challenge of catching Abra was intentional, creating a creature that rewarded players who had the tools and patience to capture it while communicating through the gameplay the design theme of a Pokemon that is extraordinarily difficult to approach or contain. Kadabra at level 16 develops Abra's psychic potential into something actively deployed rather than defensively employed. The spoon that Kadabra holds and became the subject of a legal dispute when the Israeli magician Uri Geller claimed that the character, which was named Jungler in Japan with an obvious reference to his name, appropriated his images and reputation without permission. The dispute affected the availability of Kadabra trading cards for over a decade and was eventually resolved in the early 2020s, allowing Kadabra to return to the trading card game after a long absence. The episode illustrated how thoroughly the franchise's designs were embedded in specific cultural moments and specific individuals' public identities. Alakazam at level above Kadabra through trading develops into one of the most offensively dominant Pokemon in the original roster. Its special stat in Generation 1 reached the highest value available among non-legendary Pokémon, and its speed was similarly exceptional, allowing it to move first against almost all opponents and deal enormous damage before they could respond. The two spoons that Alakazam holds are described as objects that the Pokémon bends with its psychic power, demonstrating its abilities through casual manipulation of physical objects, and the overall design communicates a kind of serene superiority, a creature that is aware of its own capabilities and has no need to demonstrate them aggressively. Machop is Pokémon number 66, a fighting-type creature with gray skin, 3 small head ridges, and a body proportion that references both sumo wrestling and the practice of martial arts training from childhood. The Machop line draws from a range of fighting traditions, mixing the broad body of the sumo wrestler with the focused intensity of the martial artist, and the progression through the evolutionary line represents a development of physical power that mirrors the training progression of a dedicated fighter moving from beginner to master over years of disciplined practice. Machoke at level 28 wears a power save belt, a restraining device that the Pokédex describes as necessary to limit the extraordinary strength the creature has developed. Without the belt, Machoke's power would be uncontrolled and potentially dangerous to itself and others. And the design choice of including a restraining garment as part of the standard presentation communicates the theme that genuine power requires discipline and containment rather than free expression. Machamp, the final evolution through trading, removes the belt concept while depicting 4 arms that move with enough speed to land hundreds of blows in a single second, according to the Pokédex entries, a physical capacity that represents both the final form of the line's power and a description that strains the boundaries of what can be visualized. Geodude is Pokémon number 74, a rock and ground type creature that is literally a rock with arms, one of the franchise's earliest and most unambiguous examples of a creature defined by its elemental composition rather than by reference to any real-world animal. Geodude waits motionless in mountain passes and rocky areas, indistinguishable from ordinary rocks until it moves, and the Pokédex entries note that hikers who trip over or step on Geodude experience the creature's defensive aggression. The design philosophy here is one of environmental integration, a creature so thoroughly made of its habitat that it cannot be distinguished from it until the moment of encounter. Graveler at level 25 and Golem through trading develop the rock into progressively more massive and more dangerous forms. Golem's design is a boulder that has grown limbs, essentially, and the Pokédex describes Golem as rolling down mountains at high speeds and causing significant damage to forests and settlements in their path. The sense of the original Kanto creatures as genuinely hazardous elements of the natural environment, rather than simply game pieces, finds consistent expression in the Geodude line's combinations of camouflage, power, and apparent indifference to the consequences of their movement. Ponyta is Pokémon number 77, a fire-type horse Pokémon with a mane and tail made of flame. The design draws from various fire spirits and mythological fire horses across world cultures, while presenting something that remains recognizably equine and accessible. Ponyta's full form has a small, tentative flame that grows as the Pokémon gains experience and confidence, and the Pokédex entries describe newborn Ponyta struggling to stand while their flame grows from a weak flicker to a full blaze as they strengthen. This developmental narrative gives the design a gentle arc from fragility to capability that the evolutionary line then extends through the transformation to Rapidash. Rapidash, at level 40, develops the horse design into something more dramatic and more urgent, with the mane expanded into a full-body flame effect and a speed described as capable of reaching 150 miles per hour from a standing start. The design language shifts from the gentle development of a young creature to the full expression of what speed and fire together look like when combined in a single form, and the result is one of the original roster's more elegant and visually coherent final evolutions. Slowpoke is Pokemon number 79, a water and psychic type creature of extraordinary mental and physical sluggishness. The Pokedex entries describe Slowpoke as so slow to register pain that it takes 5 seconds to react to having its tail bitten, and so slow to process information that the thoughts moving through its mind sometimes take several seconds to travel from one end of its body to the other. This profound, constitution-level slowness is not presented as a deficiency, but as a characteristic, something intrinsic to what Slowpoke is, rather than something to be corrected. Slowpoke's tale is the source of a dark economic subplot in the original anime and in the game's expanded lore. In the Johto region storyline, Team Rocket was revealed to be operating a scheme involving harvesting Slowpoke tails for sale as a delicacy, a detail that introduced genuine ethical weight into the franchise's treatment of its creatures as things that could be exploited and harmed for profit. Slowpoke's perpetual benign expression made the idea of its exploitation more rather than less disturbing. The creature's inability to understand or respond to what was happening to it presented as a kind of vulnerability that demanded protection. Slowbro, the evolution at level 37, occurs when a shelter bites down on Slowpoke's tail. This evolutionary trigger is unique in the original games, a creature that evolves not through experience or exposure to an elemental stone, but through the attachment of a separate organism to its body. The shelter that triggers the evolution is changed by the process as well, taking on a spiral shell shape rather than its usual clam configuration. The symbiotic or parasitic nature of this relationship, and whether it represents a benefit or a harm to the Slowpoke, is left deliberately ambiguous in the lore. Magnemite is Pokemon number 81, an electric and steel type, though in the original games it was classified as electric only, with the steel typing added in Generation 2 when that type was introduced. The design is one of the most literally mechanical in the original roster, a floating magnet with a single eye and 2 horseshoe magnets attached to its body. The franchise's willingness to include creatures that are visibly artificial or mechanical in origin rather than biological is established early in the original roster through Magnemite, Voltorb, and related designs, creating space within the world for entities that operate according to different principles than the creatures inspired by real animals. Magneton at level 30 represents 3 Magnemite that have joined together, presenting what appears to be a mechanical cluster rather than a single organic development. The magnetic field generated by Magneton is described as powerful enough to interfere with electronic equipment, halt the function of pacemakers, and affect the compass readings of navigational instruments in its vicinity. These practical effects on technology give Magneton a quality that no purely biological creature could possess, grounding its power in observable physical principles while extending those principles to dramatic degrees. Farfetch'd is Pokemon number 83, a normal and flying type duck that carries a leek stalk it uses as a weapon in battle. The design draws from a Japanese idiom about a duck that conveniently brings leek for its own soup, which translates to an expression of something being too convenient or too good to be true. Farfetch'd is described in the Pokedex as rare because it was overhunted, because the combination of the Pokemon itself and the leek stalk it carries makes an excellent meal, and hunters pursued it to near extinction. This detail gives Farfetch'd one of the franchise's earliest and most direct environmental conservation narratives, a creature that exists in small numbers as a direct consequence of human exploitation. Doduo is Pokemon number 84, a normal and flying type 2-headed bird that cannot fly despite its typing. The design draws from the ostrich and the emu, large flightless birds that use speed on the ground rather than flight for locomotion, and the two heads are a fantastic exaggeration of a biological curiosity that makes the design immediately memorable. The mechanical question of how a creature can have a flying type without flying ability is answered in this case by the observation that flying type in the original games referred more generally to birds and aerial animals than specifically to airborne creatures. Dodrio at level 31 adds a third head to the design, completing the trio. The three heads of Dodrio are described in the Pokédex as representing three different emotional states: joy, sorrow, and anger, which express themselves through the different expressions visible on each head. This multi-headed design, with differentiated psychological states, mirrors similar motifs across world mythology, where multi-headed creatures often represent different aspects of a single nature or different perspectives on a shared situation rather than simply three of the same thing. Seal is Pokémon number 86, a water-type seal Pokémon with a horn on its head that it uses to break through ice. The design is relatively straightforward, a seal with a distinctive horn, and its Pokédex entries describe it as thriving in freezing waters and using the horn both to navigate under ice sheets and to deliver headbutt attacks that generate considerable force. Dugong at level 34 develops into a more elegant and capable form with a sleek appearance that emphasizes fluid motion through cold water and Pokédex entries that describe sustained high-speed swimming in sub-zero temperatures. Grimer is Pokémon number 88, a poison-type sludge creature with no defined form, created according to the Pokédex by ultraviolet rays acting on polluted sludge in industrial waterways. The design presents a creature born from industrial contamination, and the Pokédex explicitly connects Grimer's origin to human environmental damage, establishing a direct causal relationship between pollution and this particular creature's existence. Muck at level 38 is the full development of this theme, a larger and more potent accumulation of toxic sludge that contaminates everything it touches and leaves behind a permanently toxic residue wherever it travels. Shelder is Pokémon number 90, a water-type bivalve with a large purple shell and a single eye visible through the gap. The most notable fact about Shelder, in the context of the original roster, is its role in triggering Slowpoke's evolution, biting down on the tail to create Slowbro, and later biting down on the head to create Slowking in Generation 2. The Shelder that participates in these evolutions transforms as well, taking on a spiral form that is visually distinct from its usual clam configuration, creating a situation where both participants in the encounter are changed by it. Cloyster at level unknown. After application of the Water Stone, develops the Shelder design into one of the more defensively formidable creatures in the original roster. Its defense stat in the original games was among the highest available, and the design communicates this through an enormous, heavily spiked outer shell that the creature retreats into completely when threatened. The gap in the shell through which Shelder's eye was visible has closed in Cloyster, with only the narrowest opening remaining, and the overall design communicates a creature that has committed entirely to defensive impenetrability as its primary strategy for survival. Ghastly is Pokémon number 92, a ghost and poison-type creature that floats as a sphere of gas surrounded by a toxic miasma. The design is one of the most abstract in the original roster, a near formless entity defined more by what surrounds it than by any fixed shape. Ghastly's Pokédex entries describe it as composed of gas dense enough to cause unconsciousness in those who breathe it, and note that wind can disperse its body temporarily, leaving it temporarily reduced and weakened. A creature whose physical existence is this fragile and this dependent on the surrounding air occupies an unusual position in the framework of creatures made of matter. The ghost type in the original games had a specific mechanical quirk that distinguished it from every subsequent generation. Ghost-type moves in Generation 1 did not affect Psychic-type Pokémon, which was the opposite of what the type chart suggested. This was a programming error, rather than an intentional design choice, and it meant that the Ghost-type Pokémon, which were positioned in the game's narrative as being particularly effective against the Psychic Gym, were actually mechanically ineffective against it. Players who relied on type advantage in that gym found their expectations subverted by an invisible inconsistency between the stated rules and the actual mechanics. Haunter at level 25 develops Ghastly's abstract design into something with more defined features, but no less disturbing implications. The hands that float around Haunter's gaseous body are described as capable of causing paralysis through touch, inducing nightmares that recur each night, and creating a sense of total joy in victims before they lose consciousness. These effects are not presented as random or malicious, but as characteristic of what Haunter is, a creature whose interactions with the living world cause effects that the living world experiences as deeply negative without Haunter necessarily intending harm. Gengar, at level above Haunter through trading, is one of the franchise's most beloved ghost-type Pokémon, with a grinning, mischievous design that has been a central element of Pokémon's visual identity since the original games. The grin is the most significant design element, communicating a creature that takes pleasure in its work, whatever that work happens to be. Gengar's Pokédex entries across generations describe it as hiding in shadows, lowering the ambient temperature of the areas it inhabits, and creating an unsettling feeling of being watched in those who pass through its territory. Despite these rather dark characteristics, Gengar has consistently been presented in the games and anime as one of the more approachable and even sociable ghost types, a creature whose apparent malevolence is more playful than predatory. Onix is Pokémon number 95, a rock and ground type creature, composed of a chain of massive rock spheres forming a serpentine body that can grow to over 28 feet in length. The design is one of the most physically imposing in the original roster, despite the relatively modest base stats, and Brock's Onix in the anime established early that the game's gym system would present challenges requiring strategy rather than simply higher levels. Onix's combination of enormous size and mechanical limitations, its offense was not exceptional, and it had significant water and grass-type vulnerabilities, made it a creature that communicated physical threat without necessarily delivering on it at every level of play. Drowsy is Pokémon number 96, a psychic-type creature based on the Baku, a Japanese mythological creature said to devour dreams. The Pokédex entries describe Drowsy as standing over sleeping people and feeding on their dreams, with a preference for the more positive and pleasant dreams over the negative ones. This feeding on the positive aspects of sleeping consciousness is one of the more genuinely unsettling concepts in the original roster when examined carefully. A creature whose relationship with humans is fundamentally parasitic and whose favorite food is the best experiences that the sleeping mind generates. Hypno at level 26 develops the dream-eating concept into something more active and more disturbing. Pokédex entries in later generations describe Hypno as having been responsible for children disappearing from a town after hypnotizing them and leading them away. This description places Hypno firmly in the category of creature whose behavior, when taken seriously on the terms the Pokédex establishes, constitutes genuine harm to human beings. The franchise has always maintained this category of disturbing Pokédex lore alongside the more benign characterizations, creating a world where the creatures are not all safe companions and where some interactions carry real risk. Krabby is Pokémon number 98, a water-type crab that is one of the smaller creatures in the original roster. The design draws from the Fiddler crab and the Dungeness crab, with large claws that are described as so powerful that the creature can lift its own weight many times over using them alone. Kingler at level 28 develops one of those claws to a size described as nearly too large for the creature to function with effectively, a growth that creates mechanical disadvantage, even as it suggests overwhelming physical power. This design choice, where an evolutionary advantage is also a kind of burden, creates something more complex than simple progression towards superior capability. Voltorb is Pokemon number 100, an electric-type creature that looks exactly like a Pokeball. The design origin is ambiguous in the lore, with some Pokedex entries suggesting that Voltorb appeared in the vicinity of power plants, where Pokeballs were manufactured, and that its resemblance to the balls might be connected to that proximity. The primary characteristic of Voltorb and its evolution electrode is their tendency to explode, triggered by being jostled by anger, by insufficient electricity, or by a variety of other causes that are not always predictable. The self-destruct move and its more powerful version, Explosion, are defining moves of the Voltorb line, allowing them to deal enormous damage at the cost of their own continued functioning in battle. Electrode at level 30 is faster than almost any other Pokemon in the original roster, with a speed stat that exceeded everything except Mewtwo in the original generation. The combination of this extreme speed with the self-destruct and explosion moves made Electrode a specific kind of competitive tool, a creature that could move first against nearly everything and deliver an enormous damage hit before either side could prevent it. The concept of a creature whose most powerful action is its own destruction occupies an interesting philosophical space, and the franchise has maintained this characteristic across generations rather than revising it away. Exeggcute is Pokemon number 102, a grass and psychic type collection of 6 egg-like creatures that function as a single entity. The design raises the same questions about individuality and collective identity that later Pokemon like Magneton would explore, with 6 components that share a psychic link and behave as a single organism despite being physically separate. When one of the 6 is cracked, the entire group becomes more aggressive, a detail that suggests a kind of distributed sensitivity to harm that does not map cleanly onto the model of a single creature with a single wound. Executor, the evolution through Leafstone, is one of the more dramatically unusual designs in the original roster. A tall palm tree with multiple heads growing from the top, each head expressing a different emotion. The design combines the tree with the creature in a way that the Venusaur line gestured toward, but that Executor commits to more fully, creating something that is genuinely more plant than animal in its visual presentation while retaining the expressive faces that give it personality. The Alolan version, introduced in Generation 7, develops this even further, making the palm tree body enormous, with a height that dwarfs the original's already considerable stature, and adding a distinct head to the tail of the body that looks in a different direction entirely. Cubone is Pokemon number 104, a ground-type creature that wears the skull of its deceased mother on its head as a helmet. This detail is one of the most overtly sad in the original roster, establishing a creature defined by a specific, irreplaceable loss carried visibly on its body. The Pokedex entries describe Cubone crying at night for its mother, its cries audible as mournful howls, and note that the bone club it uses in battle is also from its deceased mother. Marowak, the evolution at level 28, channels the grief into something more controlled and more powerful, described as having come to terms with its loss and developed from a crying, vulnerable child into a hardened, skilled fighter. The ghost of the Cubone's mother appears in Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town, one of the original game's most atmospheric locations. Lavender Town is the location of a Pokemon graveyard, a place where Pokemon and their deceased companions are remembered and mourned, and the narrative that unfolds there involves both Team Rocket's exploitation of the dead and the resolution of the Marowak mother's ghost that has been unable to move on. The emotional register of this narrative is unusual for a game targeting children, and the Lavender Town sequence remains one of the most discussed portions of the original games for the way it handled loss and grief with something approaching genuine seriousness. Hitmonlee is Pokemon number 106, a fighting-type creature named after Bruce Lee with an extraordinarily flexible leg design that can extend to twice its normal length when delivering a kick. The spring-like joints and the emphasis on kicking as the sole offensive strategy give Hitmonlee a design that is almost entirely about the mechanical expression of a single concept, the power and speed that can be generated through well-trained legs. Hitmonchan at 107 is its counterpart, named after Jackie Chan, with a boxing glove design and an emphasis on punch-based offense. These two designs are available exclusively through a choice made in Saffron City, where the player can only receive one of the two. The requirement to choose between them without the ability to obtain both in a single playthrough is one of the original game's methods of encouraging trade and connection between players, creating situations where obtaining a complete collection required engaging with other players who made different choices. This deliberate incompleteness was a design philosophy that shaped the original games from their conception as a social experience rather than a solitary one. Lickitung is Pokemon number 108, a normal type creature with an extraordinarily long tongue that can extend to over 6 feet and is described as being wrapped twice around the Pokemon's body when not in use. The tongue is sticky and sensitive, used both for capturing prey and for gathering information about the environment through taste and touch. The design emphasizes this single physical characteristic to a degree that makes Lickitung immediately recognizable, while leaving the rest of the design deliberately understated, a design philosophy that concentrates visual attention through exaggeration rather than through overall complexity. Coughing is Pokemon number 109, a poison-type creature that is essentially a sphere of toxic gas with a grinning face and skull and crossbones markings. The design is one of the most direct in the original roster, using conventional warning symbols associated with poison to communicate the creature's nature immediately. Wheezing, the evolution at level 35, combines two coughing into a two-headed form with an additional smaller sphere growing between them, and Pokédex entries describe the gas it produces as among the most foul-smelling in the world. James from Team Rocket's ownership of a Koffing in the anime created a long-running association between the gas Pokemon design and the broadly endearing villains, softening what could have been purely threatening designs into something more complicated and more affectionate. Rhyhorn is Pokemon number 111, a ground and rock type creature based on the rhinoceros with additional armor plating and a prominent horn. The Pokédex describes Rhyhorn as not particularly intelligent. Running in straight lines, it cannot easily deviate from once it begins charging, and capable of destroying iron buildings with the force of its charges. The combination of enormous power and limited directional control creates a creature that is dangerous, not through malice or strategy, but through the simple, unstoppable expression of physical force directed with more momentum than precision. Raiden at level 42 develops the design into something significantly more capable and more consciously aggressive. Its horn, described as capable of drilling through solid rock and even diamonds by spinning at high speed, and its ability to swim through lava are among the more dramatically stated physical capabilities in the original Pokédex entries. Raiden was notably the first Pokemon ever designed according to the accounts of the franchise's early designers, making it a historically significant design in the context of how the series developed, even though players encountering it in the games would have no way of knowing this. Chansey is Pokemon number 113, a normal type creature that carries a single egg in a pouch on its belly. The egg is described as extraordinarily nutritious, restoring the health of anyone who eats it, and Chansey are described as rare and elusive, bringing happiness to those fortunate enough to find them. The egg-carrying design, the round, gentle appearance, and the happiness association established Chansey as one of the original roster's most explicitly nurturing creatures, a design that references care and provision rather than combat and power. Chansey's competitive role was entirely defined by its extreme HP stat and its access to healing moves. In the original games, Chansey had the highest HP stat of any non-legendary Pokemon and access to Soft Boiled, a reliable healing move that allowed it to restore a significant portion of its health each turn. In the special stat era of Generation 1, Chansey's high special stat also made it difficult to damage with special attacks, creating a Pokemon that was extremely difficult to knock out quickly and that could sustain itself over extended battles. Tangela is Pokemon number 114, a grass-type creature entirely covered in blue vines that conceal its body completely. What lies beneath the vines is unknown, a detail the Pokédex acknowledges directly by noting that the creature's actual body has never been seen by researchers. The vines grow back immediately if cut, and Tangela can release them voluntarily to escape from predators, leaving the attacker holding a bundle of vines while Tangela retreats. The design's complete concealment of its underlying form is one of the original roster's more committed mysteries, maintained across generations as a deliberate choice. Kangaskhan is Pokemon number 115, a normal type creature that carries a baby in its pouch. The design establishes parental protection as a core design theme, with the adult protecting the young in a way that makes the relationship central to the creature's visual identity. The baby in the pouch was given its own interaction in battle through Kangaskhan's Mega Evolution in Generation 6, where the baby leaps out to attack alongside the parent, sharing each of the parent's moves in the same turn through the ability Parental Bond. The Mega Evolution was one of the most discussed competitive additions of Generation 6, with Parental Bond's effect of doubling the number of hits delivered per turn, creating a Pokemon of significant offensive capability. Horsea is Pokemon number 116, a water-type creature based on the seahorse with a distinctive dragon-like design element in its tail fins and spines. Seahorses are among the natural world's most unusual animals, with the male carrying and giving birth to the young, and their extremely slow movement and reliance on camouflage as a primary defense strategy. The seahorse also produces its locomotion by vibrating a small dorsal fin rather than through the conventional fish methods of body undulation, giving it a quality of nearly imperceptible movement that is quite alien to creatures that move the way most vertebrates do. Seadra, at level 32, develops the seahorse design with more elaborate spines and fins, and Pokédex entries describe the spines as venomous and capable of causing serious injury, creating a defense mechanism that adds to the design's complexity. Kingdra, added as a final evolution in Generation 2 through trading while holding the dragon scale, develops the design into a dragon-type seahorse that was, at its introduction, one of the more difficult Pokemon to counter in competitive play due to the limited availability of moves that were effective against the water and dragon-type combination. Goldeen is Pokemon number 118, a water-type goldfish with a prominent horn and flowing orange fins. The design draws from the ornamental goldfish varieties bred in East Asian cultures for aesthetic rather than practical purposes, particularly the varieties with elaborate tail and fin structures. Seeking, at level 33, develops the design with larger fins and a more aggressive horn, and Pokédex entries describe Seeking as drilling into boulders to create nesting areas using its horn. a behavior that gives the otherwise decorative design a functional purpose in the context of the creature's actual life. Staryu is Pokemon number 120, a water-type star-shaped creature with a red core gem at its center that glows during the night. The design is one of the most geometrically abstract in the original roster, a literal star shape without the additions of a face or limbs that most designs include to create a recognizable character. The core gem is described as pulsing with energy and is connected to something cosmic, and the Pokédex entries suggest that Staryu uses this core to communicate with distant stars. Starmie, the evolution through Waterstone, adds a psychic typing and develops the star shape into something with more visual complexity, a double star form with a circular center, and achieves one of the higher combined stat totals among non-legendary original roster members. Scyther is Pokemon number 123, a bug and flying type creature with bladed forearms that are described as sharp enough to cut through the toughest materials and is moving faster than the eye can follow. The design draws from the praying mantis, which uses similar blade-like forelegs for both hunting and defense, and from the general design vocabulary of the samurai, with a color and posture that references the disciplined, battle-ready warrior. Scizor, added as an evolution in Generation 2 through trading with a metal coat, transformed Scyther's speed-focused design into one with enormous physical power and the steel typing that provided significant defensive advantages. Jinx is Pokemon number 124, a psychic and ice-type creature with a human-like appearance that drew from the Gengoro fashion trend in Japan, which involved dark skin combined with elaborate blonde hair and makeup. The design's human-like features created both cultural resonance and controversy, particularly in Western contexts, where the combination of dark skin and humanoid features was interpreted through a different cultural framework. The design was later altered to give Jinx purple skin rather than the original black, with the franchise acknowledging that the original presentation was problematic in certain cultural contexts. Electabuzz is Pokemon number 125, an electric-type creature with a design that blends tiger-like stripes with electrical emission, communicating its type through both visual pattern and physical characteristic. Magmar at 126 is its fire-type counterpart, with a design that emphasizes heat and combustion through color and physical emission. These two creatures were positioned as rough analogs to each other across the Generation 1 games, appearing in version-exclusive locations and representing different elemental directions from a shared design philosophy of medium-sized, humanoid, typing-specific creatures with significant offensive capability. Pinsir is Pokemon number 127, a bug-type creature with enormous horned mandibles that it uses to grip and lift opponents, far exceeding its own weight before throwing them. The design draws from the rhinoceros beetle, one of the strongest animals on Earth relative to body weight, and the mandibles are the design's most dominant feature, defining the creature's primary combat strategy through their presence. Pinsir was one of the original games' version, exclusive Pokemon, available only in blue and requiring trade to be obtained by red players, and its fierce and somewhat intimidating appearance differentiated it clearly from the other bug-type options in the Kanto roster. Tauros is Pokemon number 128, a normal-type bull with 3 tails that it whips against its flanks to increase its own aggression before charging. The design is one of the original roster's most purely physical creatures, with no type-defining visual elements beyond the muscular bovine form and the behavioral characteristic of whipping itself into a state of combat readiness. In the original anime, Ash catches 30 Tauros in the Safari Zone off-screen over the course of many episodes, and this large collection of the same Pokemon became a recurring reference point in discussions of the anime's sometimes unusual approach to continuity and quantity. Magikarp is Pokemon number 129, a water-type fish that is almost entirely without utility in battle. In the original games, Magikarp knows only Splash, which does nothing at all and cannot learn any additional moves until level 15 when it learns Tackle. It is the weakest Pokemon in the original roster by almost every meaningful measure, and the Pokédex entries across generations reinforce this with descriptions of Magikarp as unable to do much more than flop around on land, capable of swimming but only by going with the current, and essentially helpless against any threat. Gyarados at level 20 is the most dramatic evolutionary transformation in the original games, a creature that goes from almost completely useless to one of the most powerful, non-legendary Pokemon available. The water and flying type Gyarados has access to powerful water-type moves, and to Dragon Dance, which in later generations became one of the most sought-after setup moves in competitive play. The contrast between Magikarp and Gyarados is an explicit design statement about patience and transformation, and it established one of the franchise's recurring thematic principles in its most extreme possible form. Lapras is Pokemon number 131, a water and ice-type creature that draws from the Loch Ness Monster and from the Plesiosaur, the long-extinct marine reptile that Nessie sightings often reference. The design is one of the original roster's most immediately appealing, with a large shell on its back that passengers can ride, a long curved neck, and a gentle expression that communicates friendliness and patience. The Pokédex entries describe Lapras as endangered due to overhunting, establishing another early example of the franchise's willingness to include ecological conservation narratives within its creature lore. Lapras became one of the most practical travel companions in the original games, as the Pokemon HM Surf required a Pokemon that could use the move, and Lapras's combination of strength, versatility, and the right natural capability made it a popular choice for that role. Its battle utility was also genuine, with high HP and special defense, and access to Ice Beam and Thunderbolt, making it a capable mixed attacker that could threaten many of the Pokemon commonly encountered in the game's later areas. Ditto is Pokemon number 132, a normal-type creature that can transform into a perfect copy of any Pokemon it encounters, replicating both appearance and moves. The design is one of the most minimalist in the original roster, a pink, featureless blob with a simple face, and this minimalism is entirely intentional. A creature whose primary characteristic is its ability to become something else has no need for elaborate physical characteristics of its own. Ditto's place in the franchise's breeding mechanics, where it can breed with almost any Pokemon, regardless of that Pokemon's own breeding compatibility, made it one of the most practically significant Pokemon in the entire roster across generations, used by players who needed to breed specific creatures without access to two compatible Pokemon of the same species. Evo is Pokemon number 133, a normal-type creature with an unusual genetic structure that allows it to evolve into multiple different forms depending on the conditions and methods of its evolution. In the original games, 3 evolutions were available: Vaporeon through Waterstone, Jolteon through Thunderstone, and Flareon through Firestone. Each evolution represented a completely different design direction: a water type based on fish and sea mammals, an electric type based on a hedgehog or porcupine with spines that channel electricity, and a fire type based on foxes and flame. The concept of multiple branching evolutions from a single base form was unique to Eevee in the original games, and it established a design principle that the franchise would return to repeatedly in later generations, adding Espeon, Umbreon, Leafeon, Glaceon, and Sylveon as additional evolutions, each requiring different conditions. The accumulated evolutions of Eevee across generations have made the line one of the most diverse single evolutionary families in the franchise, with 8 possible final forms covering 7 different types. The character of Eevee as adaptable, capable of becoming many things, has made it one of the franchise's most consistently beloved original designs. Vaporeon's design draws from the sea cat, a creature from mythology, and from marine mammals more generally, with a mermaid-like tail, fins behind the ear, and a ridge of dorsal fins running from head to tail. The ability to melt into water and become difficult to distinguish from the surrounding liquid is one of the design's distinctive characteristics, and the combination of high HP and excellent special stats in the original games made Vaporeon one of the most practically capable EVA evolutions in that era. Jolteon develops the electricity angle through a spiky design that makes the discharge of static electricity visually immediate. The sharp, angular fur that points outward communicates readiness and potential energy, and the high-speed stat that Jolteon possesses makes it one of the fastest Pokémon available in the original games, turning the electricity theme into a mechanical characteristic through the design philosophy that speed and electrical energy are conceptually related. Flareon takes the 3 original evolutions in the direction of sustained heat and power rather than speed or adaptability, with a design that emphasizes the fire through a large fluffy mane and tail that glow with the heat of the fire sac inside the body. Flareon's competitive limitations in the original games and across many subsequent generations came from the mismatch between its highest stat being special attack, which fire moves would use, and the fire moves that Flareon could learn in the original generation. This mechanical gap between what Flareon appeared designed to do and what it could actually accomplish most effectively was a recurring frustration for players who selected it for reasons of design preference. Porygon is Pokémon number 137, a normal-type creature that is explicitly digital in origin, the first Pokémon to have been created entirely through computer code rather than through natural processes or human craft. The design acknowledges its computer-generated nature through its geometric, faceted appearance, with flat surfaces and angular shapes that suggest a 3-dimensional model rather than a biological creature. Porygon exists in cyberspace as well as the physical world, and early Pokédex entries describe it as capable of moving freely through the internet. Porygon became associated with one of the franchise's most significant controversies through the Pokémon anime episode that caused seizures in hundreds of Japanese viewers through its use of rapidly flashing red and blue light effects. Pikachu's lightning attack in that episode created the strobing pattern that triggered the medical events, but the episode was titled after Porygon, who appeared in the episode. The episode was never broadcast outside Japan and was removed from rotation, and Porygon, Porygon 2, and Porygon Z never again appeared as significant anime characters, despite none of them being responsible for the incident. Omanite and Kabuto are Pokémon numbers 138 and 140 fossil Pokémon that can be revived from ancient artifacts found during the game. Omanite draws from the Ammonite, an extinct group of cephalopods with spiral shells that were extraordinarily common in the world's ancient oceans and are now among the most recognized fossil forms. Kabuto draws from the horseshoe crab, which is not actually a crab, but is more closely related to arachnids, and which is one of the most evolutionarily conserved animals alive today. The horseshoe crab has existed in nearly its current form for approximately 440 million years, making it one of the oldest living animal designs on Earth. The fossil revival mechanic in the original games introduced the themes of resurrection, extinction, and the relationship between past and present that the franchise would develop more explicitly in later generations. The act of reviving a creature that had been gone from the world for millions of years and then training it as a companion is one of the more philosophically loaded mechanics in the original games, though the games themselves treat it as a straightforward feature rather than a subject for extended reflection. Aerodactyl is Pokémon number 142, a rock and flying type fossil Pokémon based on the pterosaur, the flying reptile of the Mesozoic era that was not technically a dinosaur but has been associated with dinosaurs in popular imagination since the earliest fossil discoveries. Aerodactyl is described as having been the most ferocious creature of its era, capable of ripping apart prey with its serrated fangs, and its design communicates this predatory history through an aggressive angular appearance and wing shapes that emphasize speed and attack rather than the gentle soaring of less combative flyers. Snorlax is Pokémon number 143, a normal type creature of enormous size and almost completely passive temperament except when eating or sleeping. Snorlax's two appearances in the original Kanto games, blocking the two routes that require the player to acquire the Pokéflute to awaken it, established it as one of the more memorable environmental obstacles in the franchise's history. The design, an enormous sleeping creature that serves as a literal roadblock until the player has acquired the right tool, communicates both Snorlax's imperviousness to ordinary interruption and the gentle humor that the franchise's designers embedded throughout the original game world. Snorlax's appeal as a design is built on the recognition of a particular kind of comfortable, untroubled existence, a creature that eats and sleeps and asks for nothing more complicated than continuation of those two activities, existing at a scale and with a contentment that many players found immediately charming. The Pokédex entries establish that Snorlax can eat over 800 pounds of food in a day and then requires nothing more than sleep to digest it, and that it is not aggressive unless its food is threatened. This combination of enormous physical presence and fundamental peacefulness created one of the original roster's most distinct and enduring characters. Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres are Pokémon numbers 144 through 146, the three legendary bird Pokémon of the original Kanto games. Articuno is an ice and flying type found in the Seafoam Islands. Zapdos is an electric and flying type found in the Power Plant, and Moltres is a fire and flying type found in Victory Road. Each represents a classical element in combination with flight, and each inhabits a specific extreme environment that is consistent with its type. The three birds are not associated with a common origin story in the original games, but are connected in the games of the Alala region to the Tapu guardian spirits, and to the overarching cosmology that the franchise developed in its later generations. Dratini is Pokémon number 147, a dragon-type creature that begins as a small, almost serpentine dragon and develops through two evolutionary stages into one of the most formidable Pokémon in the original games. Dragon-type in the original games was mechanically unusual for reasons that have been discussed extensively since the franchise began. Dragon-type moves were limited to Dragon Rage, which dealt a fixed 40 damage, making the offensive use of the typing nearly useless. But Dragon-type had almost no weaknesses, with only Ice-type and other Dragon-type moves being effective against it, creating a defensive situation that was very difficult to breach. Dragonair at level 30 develops the pure dragon design into something more elegant and more mystical, with crystal orbs on its neck and tail that glow when it uses its abilities, and a sinuous body that the Pokédex describes as capable of controlling the weather. The ability to control the weather is one of the more dramatic powers attributed to any non-legendary Pokémon in the original games, and it connects Dragonair to the long tradition of dragon creatures in East Asian mythology that are associated with rain, rivers, and the weather patterns that govern agriculture and survival. Dragonite at level 55 is one of the original game's most powerful, non-legendary Pokémon, with high stats across most categories and access to the move Hyper Beam, which in the original game's mechanics was among the most powerful single-hit attacks available. The design shifts from the elegant, serpentine Dragonair into something more rotund and less immediately imposing, a change that players have discussed since the original games as either a charming subversion of expectations or an odd design discontinuity, depending on their perspective. The friendly expression and rounded proportions of Dragonite created a creature that looked more like a mascot than a terrifying apex predator, and this contradiction between appearance and capability became part of the design's enduring appeal. Mewtwo is Pokémon number 150, the final non-mythical Pokémon in the original National Pokédex, and it carries the heaviest thematic weight in the original game's narrative. Mewtwo was created through genetic manipulation of Mew's DNA, grown in a laboratory, and shaped into a weapon of extraordinary destructive power without its consent or participation in its own creation. The original game's presentation of Mewtwo as the ultimate challenge, found alone in a cave accessible only after defeating the Elite Four, gave it a narrative weight that extended beyond its mechanical role as the strongest available Pokémon. Mewtwo's Pokédex entries across generations describe a creature that never knew anything other than the laboratory that created it, that has no knowledge of a mother, and that has a savage heart and a genetically designed capacity for destruction. These descriptions create a portrait of a creature defined entirely by the circumstances of its creation rather than by any nature it developed independently, and the moral question of what is owed to a being engineered for a specific purpose without consent is one that the franchise has returned to repeatedly through Mewtwo-centered stories in the anime, the games, and the films. The first Pokémon movie placed Mewtwo at the center of a story explicitly about the ethics of creation and the rights of created beings, asking whether a creature that did not choose its own existence has an obligation to fulfill the purpose it was made for. The film's resolution, which did not provide a simple answer to that question, was unusual for a children's film and contributed to the emotional response that made it one of the most commercially successful animated films of its era. Mew is Pokémon number 151, a psychic-type creature described as the ancestor of all other Pokémon, carrying within its DNA the genetic template from which every other Pokémon's design was derived. The Pokédex entries describe Mew as capable of learning any move, possessing a cellular structure that allows it to transform its body freely and appearing only to those who are pure of heart. This last characteristic, which attributes to Mew not just extraordinary power, but a kind of moral discernment, elevates the design from the purely mechanical to something approaching the mythological. Mew's existence in the original games was hidden through a method that was not officially disclosed, accessible only through events and distributions rather than ordinary gameplay. This deliberate withholding created one of the franchise's most persistent and generative mysteries, with players across a generation constructing elaborate theories about how to find the creature legitimately within the game. The Mew glitch, discovered through player experimentation, allowed access to Mew through a specific sequence of actions involving encounters and battles in a particular order, and this discovery became one of the most celebrated examples of a franchise's player community finding something that was not put there intentionally but emerged from the interaction of the game's underlying systems. The relationship between Mew and Mewtwo forms the thematic core of the original game's most deeply felt narrative. A creature described as ancestral and pure, existing naturally in the world, and a creature created from it through violence, grown in a laboratory to be a weapon, existing only because its predecessor was found and its DNA extracted. These two creatures, placed at positions 150 and 151 in the National Pokédex, represent the oldest and the newest, the natural and the made, the ancestor and the inheritor of an unwanted legacy. The original 151 Pokémon of Kanto were designed by a small team, many of them by Ken Sugimori, and they established the visual and conceptual vocabulary that every subsequent generation would build upon. The original roster contains creatures drawn from Japanese folklore, from real-world biology across almost every major animal group, from chemistry and geology, from mythology of multiple cultures, from children's toys and cultural archetypes, from the abstract principles of elemental forces, and from the specific cultural moment of Japan in the mid-1990s when Game Freak was designing them. Each one was a response to a creative brief, a problem to be solved, a gap to be filled in a roster that needed to feel like a world rather than a collection. Some solutions were more elegant than others. Some inspirations are more immediately apparent, and some are buried deep enough that the connection requires research to uncover. But all 151 are parts of a coherent, creative project that established something that had not existed before, a world populated by a specific kind of creature that was neither pet, nor monster, nor weapon, nor companion, but somehow all of these things simultaneously. There is something worth returning to in the design of Kanto's gym leaders, and in how those encounters were designed to communicate more than simply a progression of challenge. Each gym leader occupies a specific role in the world of Kanto that extends beyond their function as a battle obstacle, and each represents a specific relationship with Pokémon that reflects a different way of understanding what the creatures are and what they are for. Brock, the first gym leader, is a rock-type specialist who is described as having devoted himself to becoming a great Pokémon breeder rather than simply a trainer. The distinction matters because it positions him as someone whose relationship with Pokémon is about nurture and development rather than competition and dominance. His gym, carved from rock and situated in a city whose principal product is stone quarrying and carving, connects the people of Pewter City to the ground beneath them in a way that makes Brock's specialization feel like a natural expression of the community he lives within rather than an arbitrary type assignment. Brock's use of Geodude and Onix in the original games created a practical challenge for players who had chosen Bulbasaur or Charmander as their starter, since both of those starters were at a significant type disadvantage against rock and ground type Pokémon. The game's placement of this first challenge was deliberate, rewarding players who had explored the early routes for additional Pokémon, or who had invested in moves that cut across the type disadvantage, and punishing those who relied solely on the starter they had been given and assumed it would be sufficient for every challenge ahead. Misty, the second gym leader, specializes in water types and is described as a natural beauty who uses her looks and her skill with water Pokémon together as part of how she presents herself to challengers. The Cerulean City Gym is built around a large pool, and the battles take place over and around the water, creating an environment that communicates the type specialty before the battle begins. Misty's signature Pokémon in the original games was Starmie, which was capable of learning Psychic in Generation 1, making it a more complex offensive threat than a simple water-type specialist would suggest, and communicating that Misty was not simply a specialist, but a sophisticated trainer who understood how to equip her Pokémon beyond the obvious. Lieutenant Surge, the third gym leader, specializes in electric types and is described as having used his Pokémon as weapons during wartime, with the electric attacks serving the same functions in his battle history that they serve in his gym battles. This detail rare in the original games for its acknowledgement that the world contains a history of conflict and that Pokemon have been used within that conflict, positions Lieutenant Surge not as someone who came to Pokemon through the standard journey of growth and discovery, but through necessity and survival. The Vermilion City Gym, full of trainers in military garb, and with a puzzle requiring the player to search through trash cans for hidden switches, communicates a different atmosphere than the other gyms of Kanto. Erica, the fourth gym leader, specializes in grass types and is described as a young woman with a serene, almost distant nature who composes haiku about flowers and who finds battling less interesting than the study and appreciation of beautiful plants. Her gym is located inside a greenhouse in Celadon City, and the trainers within it use grass-type Pokemon in a way that creates an atmosphere of cultivation and care. Erica's apparent disinterest in battle as a primary mode of engagement with Pokemon creates a character who values different aspects of the creatures than most gym leaders, and whose success is built on her profound understanding of what her Pokemon are capable of growing into rather than on competitive aggression. Koga, the fifth gym leader in the original game sequence, is a ninja who specializes in poison types and in the use of status conditions and indirect strategies rather than direct offensive power. His gym is designed to disorient, with walls that create confusion about direction, and his battle style relies on moves like Smokescreen, Supersonic, and Toxic to wear opponents down through accumulated disadvantage rather than through a single powerful blow. This indirect approach, which mirrors the principles of ninjutsu as they are represented in popular culture, makes Koga one of the original game's most challenging opponents for players who have relied on brute force throughout the earlier portions of the journey. Sabrina, the sixth gym leader, specializes in psychic types and is described as a woman with frightening psychic powers who developed her abilities from childhood and who finds social interaction uncomfortable because of the difficulty of being surrounded by the surface thoughts and emotions of everyone around her. The Saffron City Gym is geometrically arranged with teleport panels that move the player between platforms in a way that requires memory and spatial reasoning to navigate, creating an environment that challenges the player's mind rather than simply their battle preparation. Sabrina's Pokemon, including Kadabra and Alakazam, represented the most mechanically dominant type in the original generation, and her gym was accordingly one of the most challenging. Blaine, the seventh gym leader, is a researcher and scientist who became a gym leader after his life's work on Pokemon fossils, and genetics drew him to the kind of deep knowledge of Pokemon that he felt deserved expression in battle. His gym is built into a volcano on Cinnabar Island, and the quiz format of his gym's trainer battles, requiring players to answer questions about Pokemon before battling, was unique among the original gym designs and suggested that Blaine valued knowledge as much as combat capability. Blaine's use of fire types, including Arcanine and Charizard in the original games, reflected a researcher's appreciation for the drama and power of combustion as a natural force. Giovanni, the eighth gym leader and the leader of Team Rocket, is the only gym leader in the original games whose identity conceals something that the player discovers gradually through the course of the narrative. Meeting Giovanni first as the boss of Team Rocket, and then as the final gym leader, creates a revelation that the official structure of the Pokemon League and the criminal organization operating throughout Kanto are connected at the highest level. The ground-type specialization that Giovanni uses in both roles creates a coherence between his identities. Ground-type in the original games was mechanically powerful, resistant to thunder, the Thunderbolt chain, and able to threaten many of the types that might otherwise challenge it. The type communicates stability, dominance, and a kind of unmovability that suits both Giovanni's official authority and his criminal power. The Elite Four of Kanto represents the final challenges before the Pokemon Champion, and each member specializes in a type that tests the player's accumulated understanding of the game's mechanics in a specific direction. Lorelei specializes in ice types and is described as a woman from a small island who formed her bond with her Pokemon through the experience of surviving extreme cold as a child. Her use of Dugong, Cloyster, Slowbro, Jinx, and Lapras creates a team with considerable bulk and with access to both ice-type attacks that are effective against the dragons and flying types a prepared player might have relied upon, and water-type attacks that cover other potential weaknesses. Lorelei's battle style is described as deliberate and careful, building advantage through status moves and through the slow application of pressure rather than through explosive offense. Bruno specializes in fighting types and is described as a man who trains alongside his Pokemon in the mountains, sharing their physical hardships and developing a bond through shared effort rather than through command and instruction. His team of 2 Onix, Hitmonchan, Hitmonlee, and Machamp, presented an unusual challenge in the original games because the rock and ground type Onix were mechanically very different from the fighting type Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee, requiring players to adjust their strategies mid-battle in ways they might not have anticipated. Agatha specializes in ghost types and is described as an elderly woman who was once a close rival of the champion's grandfather, a relationship that places her within a personal history that the game acknowledges but does not fully explore. Her use of Gengar, Haunter, Arbok, and Clefable created battles in the original games where the inconsistency of the ghost type's mechanical behavior against psychic types could create significant problems for players who expected the type chart to apply, as stated. Agatha's Gengar became one of the more mechanically interesting opponent choices in the Elite Four for players who understood the discrepancy. Lance specializes in dragon types and is the leader of the Elite Four in the original games, presenting the final challenge before the champion. His team of Gyarados, Aerodactyl, Dragonair, and Dragonite represented the greatest concentration of powerful and rare Pokemon in any single opponent's team in the original game, and the design decision to give Lance 2 Dragonair before the Dragonite communicated a wealth of rare and powerful creatures that no ordinary trainer would have access to. Lance's character as a noble, somewhat romantic figure who regards dragon trainers as a special breed set the template for how the franchise would characterize specialists in rare and powerful types across generations. The champion of the original Kanto games is the player's rival, a character who began the game one step ahead in every way, and who has arrived at the title of champion through effort and skill that the player then demonstrates was insufficient preparation for the final confrontation. The rival's team in the original games is built around the starter Pokemon he chose in contrast to the player's choice, creating a symmetry between the two journeys that makes the final confrontation feel like the culmination of a parallel development rather than a random challenge from a stranger. The towns and cities of Kanto each carry specific design philosophies that connect the human world of the game to the Pokemon that inhabit the roots surrounding them. Pallet Town, the starting location, is described as a small, quiet town, barely large enough to be called a town at all, and the sense of smallness and quietness is the appropriate beginning for a journey that will expand to encompass the entire region. Palette, in the context of painting, refers to the board on which colors are mixed, and the name communicates that the town is the starting point of something, the blank surface on which the player's story will be composed. Viridian City, the first city outside the beginning, takes its name from the color Viridian, a shade of blue-green, and is surrounded by the Viridian Forest that gives the region its first forest challenge. The color naming convention that applies to the Kanto towns, each named for a color or shade, was the first expression of a pattern the franchise would use across its first regions, with Johto's towns named for trees and Hoenns named for materials that relate to the earth. The color names of Kanto's locations give the region a painter's sensibility, as though the landscape itself is being described in terms of visual impression rather than geographic fact. Pewter City, in addition to the dark gray pewter for which it is named, is described as a city of stone and science, with the Natural History Museum that gives players access to the old amber fossil alongside the gym that challenges them with rock-type Pokémon. This combination of scientific institution and combat venue present in a single city creates a geography that acknowledges different ways of engaging with the natural world without treating them as contradictory. The museum studies the ancient past. The gym tests mastery of the living present. Both are ways of understanding Pokémon, and the city that contains both treats them as complementary rather than competing. Cerulean City's blue color name and water-adjacent location create a coherence between name and content that is characteristic of the Kanto towns at their best. The cape north of the city, accessible after acquiring the appropriate HM, is one of the first examples in the franchise of a location that becomes accessible as the player's capabilities grow, a design principle that the games use throughout their structures to create a world that reveals itself progressively rather than presenting everything available from the beginning. Lavender Town, whose name does not follow the standard color convention for Kanto in the game's English localization, is positioned at the northeastern edge of the main map and functions as the location of the Pokémon Tower, the memorial site for deceased Pokémon. The atmosphere of Lavender Town was enhanced in the original Japanese release by a musical theme that was specifically designed to create unease, using a higher-pitched register and an unusual harmonic structure that differs from every other location theme in the original games. Reports of players finding the music disturbing, particularly younger players, led to the Lavender Town music becoming one of the more discussed pieces of audio in the franchise's history. The Pokémon Tower itself is designed as a genuine exploration of what it means to mourn a Pokémon that has died. The structure is dedicated to the deceased Pokémon of trainers who loved them, and the ghost Pokémon that inhabit its upper floors create an atmosphere of genuine spiritual weight rather than a simple enemy encounter zone. The narrative that unfolds within the tower involving Team Rocket's exploitation of the deceased Marowak and the resolution of that ghost's unfinished business gives the location a moral and emotional depth that is unusual in a game primarily oriented around collection and competition. Celadon City, the largest city in the original Kanto region, contains both the department store that is the franchise's first major shopping center and the game corner that provides access to the Sylph Scope needed to advance the Lavender Town narrative. The city's name evokes Celadon ceramic, a distinctive pale green glaze used in East Asian pottery, and the large, sprawling nature of the city communicates the density and complexity of urban life in a world where Pokémon trainers, ordinary citizens, researchers, and criminal organizations all coexist in the same spaces. Fuchsia City, at the southern edge of the reachable Kanto map in the original games, contains both a safari zone, where Pokémon can be caught through different rules than standard encounters in the gym, where Koga tests the player's understanding of indirect battle strategies. The Safari Zone is one of the original game's most distinctive locations, a place where Pokémon can only be caught by throwing bait and Pokeballs rather than through battle, creating an experience that is entirely different from standard gameplay and that captures something about the difference between catching wild animals in natural settings versus the standard Pokémon battle mechanic. Cinnabar Island represents both a geographical extreme of the original Kanto map, a volcanic island accessible only by water or by fly, and a narrative concentration of the franchise's most significant scientific and ethical content. The Pokemon Mansion on the island contains laboratory notes that provide the background story for Mewtwo's creation, and the research facility, where fossil Pokemon can be revived, connects the island to the prehistoric past in a way that balances the forward-reaching ethical questions of genetic engineering with a backward-reaching engagement with extinction and recovery. Saffron City is the largest city in terms of narrative significance, containing the Sylph Company building where one of the game's most extended dungeon sequences takes place, the Psychic Gym, and the dojo that provides access to either Hitmonlee or Hitmonchan. The corporate headquarters of the Sylph Company occupies an entire large building and represents the franchise's most extended engagement with the idea that the tools of Pokemon training are themselves products of an industrial economy. Someone designs and manufactures the Pokeballs. Someone creates the technical machines. Sylph is the answer to where these things come from, and Team Rocket's occupation of the building is a narrative statement about the relationship between corporate power and criminal organization. Vermilion City's harbor connects Kanto to the world beyond the region through the cruise ship that Pokemon Red and Blue players could board to find an older gentleman who would trade specific Pokemon and provide access to HMs needed for the journey. The harbor's existence acknowledges that Kanto is not a closed world, but part of something larger, connected to other regions and other places by the same shipping routes that connected real-world Japan to the rest of the world. This small geographic acknowledgement would be expanded enormously in later games as the franchise developed its world building to encompass the connections between regions explicitly. Viridian Forest occupies the passage between Pewter City and the Pokemon Trainer Road, and it is the first location in the original games where the density of encounters and the sense of the natural world as something to be navigated rather than simply passed through becomes apparent. The forest is filled with bug-type Pokemon, with Caterpie and Metapod and Pikachu available within its green shadows, and the trainers within it are young and enthusiastic, the kind of children who spend their time exploring natural spaces and catching insects. The forest communicates the beginning of an ecological world, a place where the human and the wild exist in active relationship rather than separated by the clean boundaries of town and route. The Safari Zone expands on this ecological engagement by presenting a space where the rules of human interaction with Pokemon are deliberately different. In the Safari Zone, the player cannot use standard Pokemon battle mechanics to weaken wild Pokemon before catching them. Instead, they must rely on bait and balls, approximating something closer to genuine wildlife management than to the combat-mediated catching that governs everywhere else. This mechanical shift creates an experience that feels different in quality rather than simply in difficulty, and it is one of the original game's more interesting design experiments in creating variety through rule change rather than through obstacle escalation. The Rock Tunnel, the underground passage between Route 9 and Lavender Town, is one of the original game's most challenging navigation experiences and one of its most effective pieces of environmental storytelling. Without the Flash HM, the tunnel is completely dark, navigable only through random movement and careful attention to the edges of the visible space. With Flash, the darkness retreats to reveal a tunnel filled with Zubat and Geodude and the occasional trainer who has made their way into the passage. The challenge of the rock tunnel communicates that Kanto is not uniformly welcoming, that some passages require specific preparation or uncomfortable patience, and that the world the player is moving through has genuine obstacles rather than simply challenges designed to be overcome cleanly. The bicycle road between Celadon City and Fuchsia City is one of the original game's most pleasant passages once the bicycle is obtained, a long road where trainers can be battled from above, while the Pokemon world feels briefly light and open rather than complex and demanding. The bicycle itself obtained through a certificate available from the Pokemon Fan Club in Vermilion City, is one of the original game's more elaborate item acquisition sequences, requiring a conversation with the club chairman and the listening patience to hear his extended tribute to his beloved Pokemon before the certificate is provided. This small social obligation, present in the heart of the acquisition sequence for one of the game's most useful items, communicates something about the values the franchise wanted to embody. Patience and social engagement are rewarded. The world offers its gifts to those who take the time to engage with it properly. The trade evolutions in the original games required access to another player with a Game Boy and a compatible cartridge, a social requirement built into the mechanical foundation of certain evolutionary paths. Gengar, Machamp, Alakazam, and Golem could only be obtained through trading, and their power relative to their pre-evolved forms made them significant competitive advantages available only to players who had other players to engage with. This deliberate social scaffolding was central to the franchise's original design philosophy, the idea that no single player's experience would be complete without connection to others, and that the world of Pokemon would reward those who found their community. Version exclusives extended this social requirement across a larger scale. Pokemon Red and Blue divided the available creatures between the two versions, with some Pokemon appearing only in one game and some only in the other. Electabuzz and Magmar, Scyther and Pinsir, Sandshrew and Ekans, and others were distributed across the versions in a way that meant completing the Pokédex required either trading with someone who had the other version or obtaining both games. This division was criticized by some players and celebrated by others as a design decision, and it shaped the early community of Pokemon players into something that organized itself around exchange and connection in ways that established patterns the franchise would sustain for decades. The Pokédex completion goal, which the franchise made central to its design philosophy from the original games, created a specific kind of engagement that differed from the narrative completion goals of most games that came before it. Finishing the story of Pokemon Red and Blue, defeating the Elite Four and the Champion, could be done with 6 Pokemon and a determination to see the journey through. But completing the Pokédex required catching, trading, evolving, obtaining from in-game events, and receiving through trades over 150 distinct creatures. The two goals, narrative completion and collection completion, created layers of engagement with different time requirements and different social dimensions. The original game's explicit encouragement of the Pokédex completion goal, present in Professor Oak's initial instruction and in the reward of the diploma provided for completion, created an aspiration that players could pursue independently of the main narrative. Some players never engaged with the collection dimension at all, playing through the story and moving on. Others made the collection the primary goal, treating the narrative as a means to the end of accessing new areas and new creatures. Both approaches were valid within the game's design, and the coexistence of these different modes of engagement was part of what made the franchise accessible to such a wide range of players. The PC storage system in the original games, managed by the character Bill, who has accidentally merged himself with a Pokemon through a teleporter experiment, is a small narrative encapsulation of the franchise's own history. Bill's accident, a science fiction premise delivered casually as the background to a system tutorial, established that Kanto's world contains a range of technologies whose ethical and safety implications have not been fully considered. The teleporter that merged Bill with a Pokemon is also the technology that trainers use to store their Pokemon in boxes, a detail that invites reflection on what the storage experience means for the stored Pokemon that the games themselves decline to explore directly. The question of what the Pokemon stored in Bill's PC system experience during their storage is one that the franchise has returned to indirectly in later games, particularly in the Pokemon Dream World mechanic of Generation 5, which imagined stored Pokemon as dreaming and developing connections with other Pokemon during their time in the system. The willingness to engage with this question, even obliquely, reflects the franchise's ongoing awareness that the implications of some of its fundamental mechanics are more complex than the game's generally cheerful presentation acknowledges. Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, the Generation 3 remakes of the original games, returned to Kanto with updated graphics, additional mechanics, and access to the Sevii Islands, a chain of additional islands that expanded the Kanto world and provided connections to the Johto region's Pokemon through encounters and trades. The Sevii Islands also provided additional narrative content, expanding on characters and events that the original games had suggested without fully developing. The remakes demonstrated that Kanto's world had the capacity to support more content than the original games had included, and that returning to the original setting with new tools and new perspectives could reveal dimensions that were present but inaccessible in the originals. The Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee games, released in 2018, offered another return to Kanto with a significantly revised catch mechanic that replaced the standard battle-based catching with a throwing mechanic borrowed from Pokemon Go. These games were explicitly designed as an entry point for players who had come to the franchise through the mobile game and were encountering the traditional games for the first time, and they used Kanto as the setting for that introduction because its recognition value was highest and because its familiarity provided a comfortable context for learning new mechanics. The Pokemon Go phenomenon, which launched in 2016 and created a global event of public Pokemon hunting through augmented reality mechanics, demonstrated that Kanto's original 151 Pokemon had a recognition and cultural presence that was essentially undiminished by the passage of 2 decades and the addition of hundreds of additional creatures to the franchise's roster. The original Pokemon were the ones people searched for first in parks and streets and local landmarks, and their presence in the real world through the game's mechanics created a form of the original collector experience that the designers could not have imagined when they were creating the original games in the mid-1990s. The cultural significance of the original Kanto Pokémon extends well beyond the games themselves, shaping how an entire generation of people understand and use the vocabulary of popular culture. Pikachu is among the most internationally recognized fictional characters of the late 20th century. Charizard's commercial value in trading card form has made it the subject of serious economic analysis. Mewtwo's story has been told in forms ranging from a children's animated film to academic writing about the ethics of genetic engineering. The original 151 Pokemon have become not just characters in games and shows, but reference points in the shared cultural language that people use to communicate their experiences and their feelings. This cultural weight was not inevitable and was not obvious in 1996. A game about catching small creatures in red and white balls, designed for a portable gaming system by a small team in Japan, became one of the most commercially successful entertainment franchises in history through a combination of design quality, cultural timing, international expansion decisions, and the specific qualities of the creatures themselves. The Pokemon that populate Kanto are not simply successful game pieces or successful merchandise. They are successful as characters, as designs that people form genuine emotional attachments to over the course of their lives, returning to them at different ages and finding different things in them than they found before. The original games were not designed with the expectation that players would return to them as adults. They were designed for children, for the specific developmental moment of a child who is beginning to understand that the world is large and full of things they have not yet encountered, and that some of those things are worth seeking out, even when the path toward them is uncertain. The design of Kanto as a world is shaped by this understanding. The routes are comprehensible, the challenges are scalable, The rewards are tangible, and the Pokemon that inhabit the world are designed to be understandable, to communicate their essential natures through their appearances and their behaviors in ways that do not require extensive prior knowledge to decode. But the adult who returns to these games finds that the comprehensibility of the design is not the same thing as the simplicity of the design. What was readable to a child because it was rendered clearly is still readable as an adult for the same reason, but the adult brings different questions to what they read. The question of why Cubone wears the skull of its deceased mother is not a question a child needs to articulate to feel the sadness of the design. But the adult can articulate it, and in articulating it finds that the sadness was always there, built into the design with the same care as everything else, waiting for the moment when the player was ready to understand what they had felt without knowing. The original games' designers were not making philosophical statements in any deliberate or academic sense. They were designing creatures for a game, and the depth they brought to that work was the depth of people who cared about what they were making and who drew from a wide range of cultural, biological, and emotional sources in creating it. The result is a design language that contains more than any single encounter with it can exhaust, more than a child can fully absorb, and more than an adult who returns to it encounters the same way twice. Kanto is the first chapter of a story that has continued for decades and that shows no signs of concluding. Each new generation has built upon what Kanto established, and each has added something to the vocabulary that the original games created. But the original vocabulary remains the foundation, the reference point against which all subsequent additions are measured and understood. When a new generation of Pokémon is introduced, players instinctively compare them to the Kanto originals, asking whether they measure up to the standard that Bulbasaur and Gengar and Lapras and Mewtwo established. Sometimes they more than measure up. Sometimes the comparisons reveal qualities in the originals that the act of comparison makes visible for the first time. And sometimes the originals reveal qualities in the newer designs that would not have been apparent without the original vocabulary to place them against. The conversation between the original 151 and everything that followed them is ongoing, and it is one of the richer creative conversations that the medium of games has produced. Pokémon Yellow, released in Japan in 1998 and internationally in 1999, was the first significant expansion of the original Kanto experience, adding the following Pikachu mechanic that allowed players to see their partner Pokémon respond to interaction, to become happy or unhappy depending on how they were treated. This system, primitive by later standards, was the beginning of the franchise's explicit engagement with the idea that the relationship between trainer and Pokémon was not purely functional. The Pikachu who followed the player in Yellow was not just a battle tool. It had a mood that the player's behavior could affect, and the game communicated this through small expressions and movements that rewarded attention with a sense of genuine reciprocity. The transition from Pokémon Yellow to Pokémon Gold and Silver, which moved the franchise from Kanto to the Johto region while still including a return to Kanto in the late game, established a pattern of connection and continuity that the franchise would sustain in different forms across many subsequent generations. The ability to travel from Johto to Kanto in the original Gold and Silver games was one of the most celebrated features of those games, creating a moment where the expansion of the world felt genuinely additive rather than simply replacing what came before. Kanto in Gold and Silver was older and slightly diminished, its gym leaders weaker than the player's fully developed team, but its presence communicated something important about what it meant for a world to persist, to continue to exist, and to be visitable even after the journey through it had been completed. The persistence of Kanto across multiple versions, remakes, and references is a design achievement that extends beyond any single game. It is the creation of a place that feels real in the specific way that fictional places feel real when they have been imagined with sufficient care and consistency. The routes have their own textures, the towns have their own atmospheres, the people within them have their own histories, and the Pokemon that inhabit the grass and caves and waters of the region have their own ecologies. This consistency of world, maintained across decades of design work and multiple creative teams, is what makes Kanto the foundation of the franchise rather than simply its starting point. The trading card game that accompanied the original Pokemon games brought the Kanto creatures into a different form, one that existed on physical cardstock and that was subject to the specific material pleasures of holding something in your hands, examining it closely, and trading it for something else. The artwork commissioned for the original Pokemon cards interpreted the designs through the lenses of multiple artists, each bringing their own understanding of what a Bulbasaur or a Charizard or a Mewtwo looked like when rendered in the medium of illustration rather than the medium of pixel art. The holographic rare cards of the original sets created a category of object that was simultaneously a game piece and a collectible and a small piece of art, and the effort required to obtain them through booster packs created a specific kind of aspiration that shaped the behavior of the children who collected them. The Charizard holographic rare card from the original base set became the most discussed and most sought-after card in the game's history, its value in the collectible market fluctuating through phases of high demand and relative availability, and returning to high demand each time a new generation of players encountered the game for the first time. The Pokemon trading card game taught many players things about probability, market value, and the specific pleasures of accumulation and organization that the games alone could not have taught. A child who sorted their cards by type, organized their rares from their commons, tracked which cards they needed and which they had duplicates of to trade, was engaging in a form of inventory management and collection curation that was genuinely educational under the covering description of play. The franchise understood this, and the design of the card game was structured to make these activities feel rewarding rather than like work. The competitive dimension of the Pokemon trading card game created a different kind of engagement for players who wished to pursue it. Building a deck, testing it against opponents, understanding the interactions between different cards, and how to construct a hand that consistently delivered what the deck intended was a form of strategic thinking that has genuine complexity and that has supported a competitive community that has remained active across the entire history of the game. The original Kanto cards established the game's basic mechanics, and those mechanics have been built upon and revised across the decades without losing the fundamental qualities that made them engaging from the beginning. The anime series that launched alongside the original games took the Kanto Pokémon and gave them a specific kind of visibility that the games could not provide. The games showed what Pokémon could do. The anime showed how they felt, what they wanted, how they related to each other and to the people around them. Ash's Pikachu refusing to evolve, Misty's Psyduck emerging at inconvenient moments, Brock's Onix making the stone walls of Pewter Gym feel alive, Team Rocket's Meowth narrating his own history with the kind of self-awareness that the games could not accommodate. The anime's Kanto Pokémon were not simply illustrations of game mechanics. They were characters with consistent personalities, specific relationships, and emotional lives that the show developed across its 100-plus episodes of the original series. The attachment that viewers developed to specific Pokémon through the anime created a layer of association that players brought to the games, where a Pokémon that had been a character in an episode became something different when encountered in tall grass. Not just a creature to be caught and trained, but someone with a history, even if that history had been established in a different medium. The original soundtrack of Pokémon Red and Blue, composed by Junichi Masuda, created musical identities for locations, battles, and situations that have retained their power across decades of revisitation. The wild Pokemon battle theme, with its urgent, looping energy, became one of the most immediately recognizable pieces of game music for the generation that played the original games, capable of producing an immediate visceral response in those who hear it decades later. The Gym Leader battle theme communicated something different, a stakes and significance that separated those encounters from ordinary battles, using harmonic and rhythmic shifts to signal that this was a moment requiring full attention. Masuda's approach to the Game Boy's limited sound hardware created melodies that worked within severe technical constraints while achieving emotional effects that music with far greater technical resources might not have matched. The limitation of a few audio channels and a specific palette of tones created a distinctive sound that belongs to those games and to that era of gaming in a way that cannot be fully replicated by technically superior recreations. The original music of Kanto was shaped by what was available, and what was available shaped what was made, in the specific way that all constraints shape the art that is created within them. The Pokemon of Kanto, the roots they inhabit, the towns and gyms, and the people who have built their lives around them, the music that plays as the player moves through the world, and the specific quality of attention that the original games asked of the people who played them. All of these things together constitute an experience that was specific to a moment and that has continued to resonate across many moments that came after it. What was created in the first Pokemon games for the original Game Boy was not just a game or a product or a franchise foundation. It was an experience of a particular kind of world, populated by a particular kind of creature that asked players to pay attention in a particular kind of way and rewarded that attention with a sense of discovery and growth and companionship that is not easy to find in any medium. The 151 Pokemon of Kanto are the population of that world, and they carry within their designs everything that was understood and hoped for and imagined about what they might become when they were created. They have become much more than anyone imagined, and they remain exactly what they always were. Both things are true, and both things are part of what makes them worth returning to on a quiet night when the roots are still and the grass is ready for the next encounter to begin. The Safari Zone, beyond its function as a location for catching otherwise unavailable Pokemon, introduces a different register of engagement with the natural world that is worth dwelling on briefly. The Safari Zone in the real world is a specific kind of place, a protected area where animals can be observed in something approximating their natural habitat rather than caught and kept. The Pokemon version of this place shares some of those characteristics. The Pokemon within the zone are not battled in the standard way. They are approached with caution, with attention to what will cause them to flee versus what will make them more comfortable, with an awareness that the goal is not domination, but careful, respectful interaction with creatures in their own space. This design philosophy, present in the Safari Zone's mechanics, is in tension with the rest of the game's approach to Pokemon catching, and the tension is productive rather than contradictory. The Safari Zone communicates that there is a version of engaging with Pokemon that looks different from battle, that values observation and careful presence over competition and capture through force, and that some creatures are encountered most authentically in spaces designed with their comfort rather than the player's convenience as the primary consideration. The Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, beyond its function as the location where the Magmar can be found and the journal entries providing Mewtwo's backstory can be read, is one of the original game's most atmospheric locations. A burned-out laboratory filled with scientists who are still researching in the ruined building, with a Pokemon that embodies combustion wandering the halls, and with the documentary record of the genetic experiments that created Mewtwo distributed through the building's rooms. The mansion creates a narrative atmosphere that rewards slow exploration rather than rapid progression. The journal entries that document the creation of Mewtwo are brief and dry in the manner of scientific log entries, and this restraint makes them more rather than less disturbing. The scientists recording the modification of Mew's DNA are not described as villains. They are described as researchers, noting observations and recording progress in the neutral language of scientific documentation. The horror, if it is felt, comes from applying one's own ethical judgment to what the neutral language describes, from understanding that the research documented in those calm entries created a being that was shaped by violence into a form designed for destruction and that never chose any aspect of its own existence. This use of documentary restraint to create ethical weight is unusual in a game targeting children, and it reflects the same willingness to take serious things seriously that the Lavender Town sequence and the Cubone lore demonstrate. The original Pokémon games were designed for children, but not designed to treat children as incapable of engaging with difficult material if it was presented carefully and without gratuitousness. The power plant east of Cerulean City is another of Kanto's more atmospherically distinctive locations, a facility that has been overrun by electric-type Pokémon who have made the machinery and the electrical infrastructure of the building their habitat. The Zapdos that waits at the back of the power plant is the location's culminating encounter, but the journey to reach it through rooms full of Magnemite and Voltorb and Electrode creates an atmosphere of electrical industry that is unlike any other location in the original games, a place where the boundary between the mechanical and the natural has collapsed, and where Pokémon have moved into and through a human structure in a way that makes the structure feel post-human rather than pre-natural. Seafoam Islands, the elaborate cave system where Articuno waits at its frozen center, represents a different relationship between environment and creature. The ice type that defines Articuno is also the environment of the caves, filled with ice puzzles that require specific items and specific strategies to navigate. The relationship between the legendary and the location it inhabits is one of coherent integration rather than simple placement. Articuno is not simply found at the Seafoam Islands. It is part of what the Seafoam Islands are, a creature whose presence is consistent with the frozen caves in a way that makes the encounter feel like a discovery of what was always there, rather than a meeting with something that was stored in the location for the player's convenience. Mount Moon, the first significant cave in the original games, establishes the pattern of caves as spaces requiring navigation skill and resource management, rather than simply presenting a sequence of battles. The Zubat frequency within Mount Moon creates the specific challenge of moving through a space where the encounters are numerous and depleting, and where the destination, the fossil that can be taken and eventually transformed into a Pokémon, requires finding the specific spot in the cave where the choice is available. The Clefairy that inhabit the deeper portions of Mount Moon, dancing around a moonstone in some of the game's supplementary materials, connect the moon rock that allows evolution to a ritual practice that the creatures who live near it have developed over generations of exposure to its energy. Victory Road, the final cave before the Pokémon League, concentrates the challenges of the entire journey into a single extended test of preparation and endurance. The Pokémon within it are strong. The navigation requires the use of multiple HMs acquired through the whole of the journey, and the other trainers encountered within it are the serious challengers who have made it this far, people whose teams reflect extended play rather than the modest collections of early game trainers. Victory Road is the last statement of the world before the final challenge begins, a confirmation that the journey has been genuine and that what was developed along the way was the right kind of preparation. The Pokémon League building itself, where the Elite Four wait in their chambers and the champion waits beyond them, is architecturally distinct from everything else in Kanto. It is a place whose purpose is entirely ceremonial and entirely oriented toward the validation of what has been accomplished rather than toward the provision of services or the development of community. The people within it exist to test, and the test exists to confirm. And the confirmation, when it comes, is the end of one kind of journey and the beginning of another. A transition from someone who is trying to become a Pokemon master to someone who has demonstrated, at least for this moment, that they have what that requires. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.